If you can translate this page, the whole $27,400 monthly salary is yours." Charles Beckett sneered under the blazing conference room lights, as the officers clapped along like it was some cheap entertainment. Maya Green, the black maid, hands trembling but eyes fierce, spoke up and translated the entire page, silencing the room. Charles froze, jaw dropped, his mocking laughter flipped into public humiliation before the crowd. This wasn't just a dare, it was a lesson. A person's worth isn't defined by class, but by intellect and dignity. Don't miss the twist. Watch till the end to see justice turn the tables. The Beckett Corporation's boardroom was flooded with light from the ceiling's crystal chandeliers, every detail in the room flaunting power and luxury. Sleek leather chairs were lined up neatly, the long table topped with dark wood reflecting the smug faces of shareholders seated around it. The tension wasn't just from the numbers and contracts under discussion, but also from the cold presence of 4 police officers standing against the wall, hands resting loosely near tasers peeking from their belts, eyes sweeping the room like a warning that even law enforcement bowed to money here. Amid the pressure, Charles Beckett, the man branded a millionaire, leaned back in his chair, lips curled into a sneer, equal parts disdain and amusement, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment just to turn it into his own private game. He slammed the table, making the wine glass ripple, and his voice thundered with mockery. "If you can translate this page, my entire monthly salary of $27,400 is yours." The words dropped. The room paused for half a beat, then exploded in laughter. Both old and young faces tilted back, laughing to tears not because the joke was clever, but because it thrilled them to see someone beneath them tossed into public humiliation. One burly officer leaned toward his partner and muttered bitterly, "Since when can black folk even read?" The moment the words left his mouth, the room howled again, laughter echoing off every surface, eyes glinting with ridicule like predators circling prey. Maya Green, the black maid in a once pristine white apron now smudged after a long day of service, stood silently at the far end of the table. Her hands trembled as Charles pushed the sheet of Chinese characters toward her, the paper still smelling of fresh ink, cold as a sentence passed. She bent to pick it up, fingers unsteady under the weight of every gaze, pinning her in place, demanding she become the centerpiece of this cruel spectacle. Whispers swirled around her ears. "Take it. Let's see what you've got." Someone like her might read a few English letters at best, but Chinese? The words tried to drown her in shame, but behind Maya's wide eyes, beneath the trembling surface, a storm of fury rose, a need to prove them wrong, burning hot. Charles's footsteps echoed steadily as he walked toward Maya, his index finger tapping the paper like he was handing her a trap. He leaned close, voice low but loud enough for all to hear. "Do you know anything about these characters? These aren't some boring letters you picked up from underfunded public schools. This is a language you'll never touch in your lifetime." Laughter spilled across the room again, a merciless chorus. One officer nearby burst out laughing, slamming his hand on the table. "If she reads that, I'm quitting today." Another chimed in, "This bet's safe, no way in hell that's happening." Emberly. Maya stood motionless, head bowed, shoulders slightly trembling. The sheet of paper in her hands felt like it weighed tons, dragging her into public humiliation. But deep within her mind, memories of her father surged forward, a man once beaten by officers, just like these, for daring to speak out against injustice. That image burned like fire inside her. She knew that if she kept her head down, she would be allowing history to repeat itself. In that moment, even as her heart pounded wildly, Maya slowly lifted her gaze and locked eyes with Charles Beckett. His eyes, full of arrogance, flickered for a second with surprise as he saw her stare, not one of submission, but resistance. The air in the room thickened, heavy with laughter and the expectation of a public breakdown. Charles Beckett crossed his arms, the smirk on his face unwavering, while the others leaned back in their chairs, waiting for the maid to stumble. The officers stood like a black wall behind her, ready to pounce should she dare raise her voice in defiance. Maya swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the edge of the paper, so tightly her nails dug into it. The brief silence was shattered by a sharp laugh from the corner of the room. "Come on already, we don't have all day to wait on this," maid stammering. The laughter echoed, triggering another wave of mockery that turned the room into an arena of ridicule. In that instant, Maya felt herself being pushed to the edge of a cliff, but also realized there was no way out except forward. Her hands shook, her heart raced, but she held onto the paper, drawing in a deep breath. The chandelier lights overhead cast down onto her face, revealing every tense line, equal parts, fear and resolve. Charles Beckett straightened, raising his eyebrows with challenge, his lips curving, as if he were already sure of the outcome of his bet. The entire room waited, each second stretching endlessly. In that suffocating air, only the sound of Maya's breath and the pounding rhythm of her heart echoed in her chest. Charles Beckett tilted his head. His sharp voice rang out again. "Well then, Maya Green, Give everyone a good laugh. This is the only chance in your life you'll ever stand in the middle of this boardroom." His words fell like the final blow of a hammer, sealing the wager with no way out. The officers broke into laughter once more, their voices blending with the rough clack of boots on the marble floor, forming a rhythm of mockery. One of them growled, tossing out another dagger, "Read it, if you can even read. If not, get on your knees and beg." Maya lifted her face, eyes locked onto the slanted characters. Trembling but resolute, she knew this moment would decide her dignity and survival. Every laugh, every insult, every look drenched in contempt closed in around her, pressing her into the depths of humiliation. But in the depths of her eyes, a small, steady light flickered like flame catching dry straw. The room, with all its arrogance and power, now seemed to shrink into a single scene: Maya, the trembling paper in her hand, and the hungry eyes waiting to witness her collapse. In that silence, no one could have guessed that everything was about to shift direction, a direction Charles Beckett and the officers never saw coming. Because in the moment that seemed certain to crush Maya, a quiet force stirred within her, and it would change not only her fate, but the entire power dynamic ruling this room. Laughter burst out like crashing waves, echoing across the vast room. Glass cups in the hands of VIP guests clinked together, each sound slicing into Maya like a blade. The opulence of the Beckett Corporation boardroom, with its long carpets and dark wooden tables, had turned into a stage where the crowd delighted in turning one person's shame into entertainment. Polished faces tilted back in laughter, their eyes gleaming with a twisted pleasure, as if nothing was more amusing than watching a small maid squirm under a challenge everyone believed she would fail. Charles Beckett leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping lazily against the armrest, his gaze indifferent but his grin wide with pleasure, like a director savoring the silence of a play he orchestrated. A police officer stepped forward from the back of the room, the taser at his hip catching the light. Raising his hand, half joking, half serious, he called out in a shrill, spiteful tone, "If she stammers, I'll fire one shot just to see if she's still faking." As soon as the words landed, the room erupted again, the laughter so loud it drowned out even the sound of swirling wine in their glasses. Some pounded the table, others bent over in hysterics, clapping as if they were watching a high-end comedy act. Maya stood in the center of this storm of ridicule, the paper in her hand shaking, every mocking word cutting deep. But in her eyes, a quiet light began to burn, a light that would not let them drag her down so easily. Charles folded his arms, sat upright, and spoke in a low voice, each word landing like a sharpened blade. "This is the smartest test you've ever faced in your life, Maya Green. And it's also the last chance for you to show us whether you're capable of anything beyond clearing tables and scrubbing floors." He emphasized every syllable, deliberately turning the challenge into a sentence, like a predator declaring victory before the kill. The crowd nodded along, clapping in agreement, their contempt visible in every glance. A woman in a blazing red dress leaned back and exhaled with a mocking smile, an uneducated girl dreaming of entering the world of knowledge. How ridiculous. Maya felt every eye pressing down, every word weighing heavily on her shoulders. Her fingers clenched the paper so tightly that dark marks formed along her skin. Sweat gathered at her temples and slid down her cheek, but her eyes were changing, no longer frozen in panic, now gleaming with defiance. She swallowed hard, a lump lodged in her throat like stone, but her heartbeat pounded louder, like war drums echoing in her chest. In her mind, the image of her father returned, the man who once taught her that words were stronger than any weapon, that language could shatter invisible chains. That memory rose up, blending with the sting of humiliation, forming a force that pushed her to lift her head. The air in the room felt frozen, every laugh sharper, every mocking word like an arrow aimed at her heart. Another officer curled his lip and shook his head in ridicule. "Hurry up, or we're all gonna fall asleep from your pathetic act." Charles stared at her, eyes ice cold, as if he already held her failure in his hand, the smirk on his face spreading slowly. But in that exact moment, when everyone was waiting for her to collapse, Maya gripped the paper tighter, her eyes lit with the fire of resistance. She was no longer trembling from fear, but from the surge of determination building inside her. Laughter kept cracking like a whip, but Maya no longer bowed her head. She lifted her chin, chest filled with breath, eyes locked on the sheet lined with slanted characters. Her rapid breathing turned into a rhythm of readiness. In her mind, the characters began to align, forming meaning she had once studied and memorized. Despite the jeering noise around her, Maya felt an eerie calm settling inside, as if all sound had been pushed far away. And in that moment, she was ready to face the challenge Charles Beckett and the others had designed to make her a punchline. The room seemed to fall briefly silent, broken only by the panting of those who had laughed too hard. Charles raised an eyebrow, tapping his finger lightly on the wooden table, the sneer never leaving his face. A police officer standing directly behind Maya lowered his voice, just enough for her to hear. "Careful, one wrong word, and your life's over." The threat slid in like a blade against her throat. But Maya said nothing. She drew in a deep breath, her trembling hand suddenly steadying, gripping the paper like the last proof she had to claim her own worth. The defiance in her eyes caught them all off guard. Everyone was waiting for the moment Maya would speak. The laughter had quieted, replaced by a silence laced with curiosity and hunger for failure. Charles Beckett leaned slightly forward, his gaze cutting through her like a knife, his voice rising again, laced with mockery and emphasis. "Well then, Maya Green, has this little test got you shaking too hard to read?" His casual grin triggered a few renewed bursts of laughter, but in that moment, Maya's eyes did not flinch. In them burned a bright flame, a silent vow that she would not let them turn her into their spectacle ever again. The air inside the Beckett Corporation's boardroom had grown so thick it pressed on everyone's chest. The loud laughter from moments ago had smothered itself, leaving behind only the echoes of rapid breaths and pounding hearts from those watching. Light from the crystal chandeliers still blazed, reflected off the dark wooden table, and cast a glow across Maya Green's tense face. She stood there, alone against the scorn of the entire room, gripping the sheet of paper as if it were the last rope above a cliff. Every insult, every threat, every mocking glance was compressed into one moment, waiting for a single outcome: her collapse. But no one realized that this exact moment was the turning point, the hinge on which everything would shift. Maya drew a deep breath, her eyes locked on the paper. The slanted Chinese characters before her looked like a wall of thorns Charles Beckett had built to expose her weakness. But to Maya, they were no longer unfamiliar. In her mind, late-night lessons returned. Dim desk lamps, worn pages, and her father's voice reciting each word filled her thoughts. She could hear him again, pausing on every syllable, and in that instant, all the jeers turned to silence, leaving only her and the language she once loved. Maya opened her mouth. Her voice, shaky at first, quickly steadied and rang through the boardroom. "Arrogance is the enemy of wisdom." The words fell, clear and deliberate, slicing through the arrogance that had cloaked the room. With every syllable, it felt like each person had been slapped across the face. The laughter frozen on their lips faded. No one could believe what they had heard. Faces that were just moments ago smug were now stiff, smiles cut short, wine glasses suspended halfway to their mouths. The only sound in the room was the heavy breathing, as if everyone had to take in air just to confirm they had not imagined the impossible. Charles Beckett, the man who had believed he controlled the entire play, sat frozen in his chair. His eyes widened, his lips parted slightly, and his confident smile vanished in an instant. He tried to keep his composure, but his face betrayed him, showing pure shock. He slumped back, jaw slack, eyes locked on Maya, unable to process that a maid had just shattered the order he had so carefully constructed. In that moment, Charles Beckett was no longer the symbol of power and wealth. He was simply a man stripped of the arrogance he had lived in. Maya lowered the paper, her eyes blazing as they locked onto Charles. She didn't need another word. Her translation alone had already flipped the board. The VIP crowd remained silent, no one daring to speak. Some turned to each other, but the looks they exchanged held no trace of mockery, only shock and confusion. The officers who had laughed moments ago now stood frozen, tasers still dangling at their sides, but not one of them moved. The entire room, every breath, every heartbeat, now revolved around one person, Maya Green. Inside Maya, the fear had not vanished, but it was being consumed by pride. She had done what no one believed possible, what they all used to ridicule her. Within her, a new confidence was forming, as if the wall separating low status from intellectual power had finally cracked. She said nothing more, letting the silence choke the man who once mocked her. That silence was more unsettling than any comeback, because it forced Charles and everyone behind him to confront a truth they could no longer deny. A whisper rose from the back row, loud and clear in the frozen air. She actually understood it. That small sentence struck like a spark thrown into a stunned crowd, stirring a ripple of murmurs. But this time, there were no jeers, only unsettled voices tinged with reluctant respect. A few guests covered their mouths, unsure how to react. One silver-haired man, a longtime partner of Beckett, frowned in discomfort not because Maya had failed, but because he now realized Charles was being openly challenged. Charles Beckett struggled to rise, lips moving as he searched for words, but his voice caught in his throat. He glanced at the officers, hoping they might speak up and restore balance, but their faces were just as stunned, not one able to offer a defense. The truth was undeniable. Maya had read every word with clarity, leaving no room for dismissal. The trap he had set was now tightening around his own neck. He turned away, but no matter where he looked, all he saw was shock mirrored in every eye around him. Maya felt the power shifting in her favor. Though her body still trembled, the heartbeat pounding in her chest was no longer the rhythm of fear, but of someone who had just climbed out of the abyss. She stood upright and spoke with clarity. "Is this what you meant to turn into a joke, Mr. Beckett?" There was no need to raise her voice. The words echoed with enough force to strike Charles Beckett down all over again. The arrogance Charles once believed was his weapon had become a burden, and now it had betrayed him. The room stayed silent, broken only by the sound of shallow breaths and eyes fixed on Maya. In that moment, the black maid, once been dismissed, stood as an equal, perhaps even above, the white millionaire who had once ruled every conversation, and from that moment forward, the joke Charles created had turned into a wound that power could no longer heal. The moment Maya's translation echoed through the lavish room and ended, a heavy silence dropped like a curtain drawn too fast. But that silence didn't last. A furious, snarling voice ripped through the air, filled with anger and disbelief. A tall police officer, face flushed red in shock, stepped forward and pointed straight at Maya. "No way. Where did you steal the answer from?" His voice tightened, chest heaving as if he might lunge forward and tear the paper from her hands. The other officers began to murmur, their eyes fixed on Maya like she had just committed an unforgivable crime. Contempt turned into rage, because to them, a maid was not supposed to break the order they and their boss had built. Guests along the long table began to lean in and whisper, their voices crawling through the room. A middle-aged man in a gleaming black suit tilted his head and asked in a low voice, "A maid could translate that." The man beside him frowned, sipped his wine, and replied quietly, "No way. There's got to be some trick." Nods of agreement spread quickly. Some turned to Charles, expecting him to explain something that would prove power and order still rested with him. But down at the far end of the table, a few eyes glimmered with doubt, mixed with a quiet admiration, because they had just witnessed something beyond belief. Charles Beckett sat still for several seconds, his gaze pulled into a void. He could feel the mask of power beginning to crack. Then he cleared his throat, straightened his back, and tried to regain control. His voice came out steady, but underneath it was urgency. "Just luck, nothing more." He gave a thin smile, waving a hand like brushing away the shock in the room, as if it had all been an illusion. A random quote, not exactly solid proof. She probably saw it somewhere, and memorized it by chance. His eyes swept the room, trying to show command, but the sweat collecting at his temple betrayed the truth. Maya stood still, both hands gripping the paper, her eyes locked on Charles. The trembling had passed, replaced by an unusual steadiness. She stepped forward half a pace, her voice firm and clear across the room. "You bet your salary, and I won." The words weren't loud or rushed, but they landed sharp and unmistakable, heard and remembered by every person present. In that luxurious setting, the sentence sliced through the false veil like a cold blade. Maya's eyes were direct and unwavering, no trace of confusion left, forcing Charles to shift his posture and avoid her stare. A new wave of murmurs rose. The guests were no longer just whispering in doubt, they were splitting into two sides. One group kept nodding along with Charles, clinging to his just luck explanation, but the other began exchanging thoughtful glances, because Maya's fluency didn't feel like a coincidence. The truth hung over them like the chandelier above their heads, undeniable even if pride wanted to reject it. The officer who had shouted earlier wasn't done. He stepped closer, hand resting on the grip of his taser, his voice hissing through clenched teeth. "Don't think you can pull tricks here. A maid doesn't just turn into a scholar." He spat out the word maid like a slap, a reminder to everyone of the low place Maya was supposed to occupy. But Maya didn't flinch. She stood tall, eyes still locked on Charles, not even glancing at the man threatening her. That only fueled the officer's anger, his rage growing from being ignored. Some of the guests watching began to feel uneasy with the rising tension, but none dared intervene. All eyes were on Charles, waiting to see how he would handle it. Charles raised a hand, signaling the officer to step back. He didn't want the scene to spiral further out of control, knowing that chaos would only weaken his position. But his eyes still burned, locked onto Maya. His voice came out tight, no longer mocking, but laced with irritation. "What do you think you just proved? One sentence? You really believe that changed the entire game?" He tried to spin the situation, shrinking the truth into something trivial. But inside, the fear was pounding louder. Maya remained silent, standing firm, letting the truth speak in her place. A female guest, face perfectly made up, ran her fingers along her neck, her expression no longer amused. She whispered to her friend, "Unbelievable." She spoke like someone formally trained. "Could we have been wrong?" The question slipped into a few nearby ears, and those who heard it flinched. The quiet hum of conversation returned, this time with less scorn and a hint of reluctant acknowledgement. Charles heard it clearly, and that, more than anything, stoked his anger. Maya stepped forward again, her voice steady, each word deliberate. "You can call it luck if you want, but you made the bet. You named the number. You laughed in my face. And now, I'm holding you to it." Her words fell like funeral bells, making Charles instinctively clench his fist. He could feel the eyes in the room shifting, no longer watching Maya, but waiting to see what he would do now that he had been cornered. The air grew heavy, each breath audible in the vast room. Charles Beckett, a man used to giving orders and being obeyed, now seemed backed into a corner by a maid. The truth was too clear, and no matter how hard he tried to argue, Nothing could hide Maya's victory. In that moment, the balance of power in the room shifted slowly, but unmistakably away from the hand that once held everything. And while Charles struggled to salvage his pride through denial, the image of Maya standing tall, eyes burning bright, became a beacon for those quietly longing to see real justice. This chain of reactions from the officer's rage, the guest's doubt, to Charles's refusal only sharpened the outline of Maya's first victory more than any words ever could. Night fell over the poor housing block on the edge of the city, where rows of worn-down buildings crowded together in narrow, dim alleys. A faint yellow glow from a dangling hallway bulb spilled onto the cracked cement floor, casting scattered beams of light that looked like they were struggling against the thick darkness. A baby cried from a nearby room, mixed with a raspy cough from someone unseen, blending with the musty scent of mildew that clung to the stained, peeling walls. Maya sat alone in her cramped room, back pressed against a rickety bed, eyes staring blankly into the space ahead. A long day of facing contemptuous stares and open challenges in the Beckett boardroom had left her body drained, but her mind still burned like a storm that refused to pass. She set the translated paper down on the scratched wooden table. The dim oil lamp cast a weak glow across the very words she had read aloud to silence a room full of wealth. The image of Charles Beckett slumping back in his chair, jaw slack, the breathless gasps of those who once mocked her, still echoed in her head. But as Maya closed her eyes, older memories surged forward, sharp as blades. She thought of her father, of that rainy night years ago, when police stormed into the narrow alley they lived in just because he dared to speak out against an injustice they had caused. Her father, Elijah Green, a gentle dock worker who never harmed a soul, was dragged into the street that night like a criminal. Maya, then just a child, had stood frozen in the corner, watching his body collapse under every brutal blow. He didn't fight back. He only tried to shield his family from senseless abuse. That scene was burned into Maya's memory, the crack of batons, the slurs about his skin, the blood spreading across the cold, wet pavement. After that night, her father carried scars that never left, both on his body and deep in his heart, and Maya carried the nightmare that never faded. From those days on, Maya understood that the world was not fair, and that people like her, born in the shadows of poverty and prejudice, would always be trampled by those who wore power like a uniform. But from her father, she learned something else, that words could be stronger than fists or clubs. Elijah Green, even as his body failed him, never stopped teaching Maya every word, every language, as his way of resisting the silence the world tried to force on him. He would often say, "Maya, when you know many languages, you don't just speak for yourself, you speak for those who are not seen, not heard, and not believed." Maya grew up with that belief, and when she entered college, she chose linguistics with a burning passion. During those days in class, listening to lectures about grammar structures, the history of language, and how every word carries the soul of a people, Maya felt as if she were touching a vast and hopeful world. She learned quickly, studied hard, and always ranked among the top students. Many professors looked at her with encouragement, saying she could go far, even win international scholarships. But that dream ended when her father's illness worsened, and tuition, along with living expenses, became a burden she could no longer carry. Maya was forced to drop out in her second year, packing her textbooks into cardboard boxes, folding thick stacks of notes, and stepping into life as a maid in villas, restaurants, and hotels just to earn enough to support her family. She still remembered her final afternoon on campus, when sunlight streamed through the window and fell across the wooden bench where she used to sit. Her friends chatted about upcoming exams and future plans, while Maya clutched her old dictionary to her chest, knowing she wouldn't return. It became one of her deepest wounds, a wound that didn't bleed but left an emptiness that would never fully heal. That night, sitting in her shabby rented room, Maya opened an old journal, its pages yellowed, the slanted handwriting of her 19-year-old self still intact. She flipped to a blank page, lowered her pen, and wrote in firmer strokes than before. "They will not walk over me again." The words stood bold and strong, like a vow etched into her heart. Each letter released a piece of the anger long held inside, and at the same time, lit a fire of resolve that she was no longer the helpless girl who cried when her father was beaten, or the poor student who had to leave her dreams behind. Outside the window, the night breeze slipped through the narrow frame, carrying the distant barking of dogs and the sharp buzz of a motorcycle engine along the old street. Maya set the pen down, closed her eyes, and for a moment, she felt her father's warmth beside her, heard his deep, steady voice once more. "Maya, never let them think you are small. You carry knowledge within you, and that knowledge will save you." Those words became her strength to endure exhausting workdays, undeserved insults, and the contempt she faced every single day. That night, in a room filled with shadows and dim yellow light, Maya carved a new sense of resolve deep within herself. She knew the road ahead was long, lined with trials and humiliation. But now, after silencing the entire Beckett boardroom, After watching Charles Beckett fall by the very weapon he chose, she realized she was capable of much more. The scar of the past would always remain, but instead of a burden, it became a mark that reminded her never to surrender. And in the darkness, the sound of her pen gliding across paper whispered softly, like the rhythm of a new beginning. Maya wrote that line over and over, letting each letter etch deeper into memory. They will not walk over me again. Those words were not just for her, but for her father, for everyone who had ever been robbed of their voice. It was a vow to herself that, from this moment on, every step she took would no longer be led by fear, but by the desire to claim her true worth. After the night in her rundown room, with old memories returning, Maya entered a new day with a different state of mind. But Charles Beckett had not cooled his rage. Being humiliated in front of the elite was, to him, the greatest disgrace of his life. Rumors spread, and people whispered about the line Maya had translated, each whisper cutting deeper into Charles's pride. In a closed-door meeting, before the murmurs had settled, he slammed the table and roared, his voice hoarse with suppressed fury. "Get her out of here. I'm not paying her a cent." The order dropped like a hammer, cold and merciless. It was no longer entertainment. It was now an absolute command, and the officers in the room took it as a signal to act. One officer moved quickly toward Maya, his face tight, eyes full of contempt. He grabbed her arm and yanked so hard that her small frame nearly lost balance. Before she could react, he shoved her to the cold tile floor, her back slamming hard, knocking the breath from her chest. The heavy sound echoed, and the room shuddered as if the truth had just revealed itself. Power could crush anyone who dared to cross the lines drawn by the wealthy. But Maya, in that moment, did not stay silent. Pain surged through her body, yet from her chest came a loud, firm cry that echoed through the space. "He's afraid of the truth." The words rang out, stopping everything for a split second. Her voice didn't shake. It was steady and strong, bouncing off every wall, striking every eye and heart in the room. The guests froze. Some looked like they wanted to laugh it off, to deflect the tension, but no one could, because they knew Maya was right, and what was unfolding before them was undeniable proof. Amid the chaos, one person quietly raised a phone. He sat in the back row, a young staffer invited to take notes, silent like a shadow all evening. But when he saw Maya thrown down and heard her voice pierce the room, he hit record. The red light blinked as the camera captured every movement, every word, every glance, every breath. The phone trembled in his hand, but stayed firm, trying to preserve evidence of a moment where power exposed its true face. He knew what he was doing could be dangerous, but instinct told him this was a truth that had to be seen. The officers pinned Maya down, their voices hissing through clenched teeth, words soaked in hatred. "Trash like you think a few translated lines make you equal to Mr. Beckett?" A sharp jab to her shoulder sent pain shooting through her, but her eyes still burned with fire. She twisted, locking eyes with Charles, who remained seated at the head of the room, his stare cold as steel. "The more you do this, the more everyone sees your cowardice," Maya said through gritted teeth, her voice hoarse but unbroken. Every word hit like an arrow, piercing through Charles's polished shell of authority, shaking him to the core. A few guests began to rise, shock spreading across the room. Some shook their heads. Others looked at their phones, not daring to film, but unable to detach themselves from the weight of what they were witnessing. The air was thick, the scuffle echoed. A glass shattered under a chair. The chaos fused into a shrill, discordant noise. But even within that noise, Maya's voice still rang out. Her scream would remain etched in the minds of everyone present, a raw truth they could no longer dismiss as spectacle. Charles shot up, shouting furiously, "Get her out of here now." His face turned crimson, veins bulging along his neck, his loss of control impossible to ignore. But in his eyes, behind the rage, was the fear of being exposed. He knew every word Maya spoke hit harder than any excuse he could offer. He knew that the image of her being dragged and silenced only proved what he tried to deny. But he couldn't stop now, because stopping would mean admitting he had lost on the very board he built. Maya was dragged away, her shoes scraping against the floor with a harsh screech. She didn't struggle needlessly, but her voice stayed steady, rising above the noise for all to hear. "You can beat me, but you can't bury the truth." The words slammed back into the hearts of those holding her down, and for a brief second, hesitation flickered in their eyes. But they gripped tighter, masking the moment of doubt with more brute force. The one holding the phone kept filming, his hand trembling with fear of being caught. The tiny red light blinking from the corner of the table looked like a small flame fighting against a wall of darkness. In the frame, Maya was not the weak one being crushed, but a symbol of resistance. She was pinned down, but her voice didn't break, her eyes didn't lower. And that moment became the spark that would ignite everything to come. A moment no one in the room, not even Charles Beckett, realized would become the crack tearing through the wall of power he had built for so long. The witnesses stayed silent, but the silence had shifted. It was no longer complicity, it was shock. No one laughed anymore. No one raised a glass. They only watched, letting the truth stand exposed in front of them. Maya, the small maid, had turned a room of opulence into a place where every eye was forced to witness the clash between intellect and violence, between truth and fabricated power. And from the moment that red light started blinking, nothing could ever go back to the way it was. That night, while the city slipped into a haze of neon lights streaking across tired streets, a different kind of light exploded online like a violent storm. A short video clip showing Maya Green being slammed down by police and shouting, "He's afraid of the truth," was uploaded to a small forum, and within hours, it spread like wildfire. The witness's phone shook in his hands during the recording, but that trembling only made it feel more real, making viewers feel as though they were standing in that room, watching the raw truth being smothered by brute force. Every second, every word, every glance from Maya, as she was pinned to the ground, struck like a blow to anyone who believed power could erase everything. Within hours of the upload, the #Translate challenge appeared for the first time and quickly took over social media. At first, people shared it out of curiosity, discussing Charles Beckett's bizarre translation challenge. But when the edited clip spread with the title, "A Maid Assaulted for Translating Truthfully," outrage erupted. Furious posts flooded the feeds. Police serving money, not justice. What year is this in America? A translated line exposed the truth, and they chose violence. Alongside #Translate challenge, other hashtags exploded. #Justice for Maya, #Truth Not Power, and rhetorical questions that slashed at the Beckett Corporation's reputation. One account with millions of followers on Twitter posted, "A maid teaches a millionaire a lesson. This isn't about translating a sheet of paper. It's about intellect standing up to violence." That tweet lit the spark that pushed the video into the global trending list overnight. Screenshots of Maya pinned down, her eyes still burning, and her cry, "He's afraid of the truth," spread like wildfire, turning her into an unexpected symbol. People began comparing her to historic figures who once stood against injustice. Online forums lit up with debates, some viewers crying, others angry enough to write full essays analyzing the incident, but all agreeing on one thing: what happened in the Beckett boardroom could no longer be hidden. In luxury apartments, on crowded subways, in coffee shops, and student dorms, everyone was talking about the video. They discussed Charles Beckett's arrogance, the brutality of the police, and above all, Maya Green's unyielding gaze. Several news channels picked up the story, broadcasting the clip with furious commentary. One anchor looked directly into the camera and asked the nation, "How much longer will it take for us to understand that power must never silence the truth?" Inside Charles Beckett's vast mansion, the atmosphere was nothing like the lavish wine-soaked evenings of the past. Charles sat in his study, holding his phone, the screen's glow casting light across his face. With each scroll, hundreds, thousands of comments appeared, filled with words pointed directly at him: coward, power, hungry, inhuman. Some online articles had even used the image of Charles with his jaw dropped, under headlines like, "The moment millionaire Beckett was crushed by the truth." Rage surged through him. His hand clenched so tightly the veins bulged. He hurled the phone against the wall, the sound of shattering glass ringing out across the room. But the weight of inevitability settled in, because he knew things had spun far beyond his control. The online storm didn't stop with videos and hashtags. People began taking to the streets, spray painting slogans on walls, printing Maya's face on t-shirts, turning her into a symbol of resistance. Human rights organizations quickly joined the movement, filing petitions demanding investigations into police actions, and calling for a public explanation from Beckett. Prominent lawyers spoke out, stating that the violent assault on Maya was a blatant human rights violation that could not be denied. Articles, sociological analyses, and media commentaries flooded every channel, as if the entire nation was being forced to confront the truth that had just been exposed. Meanwhile, Maya remained in her old rented room, quietly watching the flood of news on a cheap phone. She read each comment, each shared post, feeling the surge of anger and support spreading everywhere. But inside, she felt neither pride nor peace, only a growing sense of responsibility. What she had accidentally set in motion had now gone far beyond a personal confrontation. She was no longer fighting for herself, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed, beaten, or silenced. The words, "He's afraid of the truth," were no longer just a cry in that boardroom. They had become the rallying cry of a movement. As for Charles Beckett, no matter how many phones he smashed, no matter how many boardroom doors he slammed shut, he could not reverse the tide of public outrage. Every time he opened his eyes, he saw Maya's face on the news, saw his name tied to shame and oppression. The grand mansion turned into a gilded cage trapping a wounded beast. The more he struggled, the more his desperation showed. He knew it was too late, because the blinking red light on that phone in the boardroom had sparked a storm no one could put out. Late at night, The narrow alley leading to Maya's building was bathed in dim yellow light from the single bulb dangling on a worn concrete pole. The air was thick with the smell of damp walls and lingering cigarette smoke from a group of men who had just left the alley's entrance. Maya clutched her frayed canvas bag, walking quickly back to her room after a long and draining day, her mind heavy with thoughts of the firestorm still raging across social media. She knew the storm hadn't passed, and she understood that those humiliated in public never let go easily. As Maya turned into the darkest stretch of the alley, two figures stepped out from a narrow corner, blocking her path. They wore plain clothes, but the sharpness in their eyes and the way they carried themselves told Maya immediately who they were. Two police officers from the Beckett boardroom, the same ones who had dragged her down now, stood before her with blank, unreadable faces. One of them spat on the ground, his voice hoarse and bitter. "You embarrassed Mr. Beckett, now you pay." The alley's stillness turned tense. Maya stopped, her hand tightening around her bag strap, her eyes fixed on the two tall men moving closer. Her breath was heavy, but her gaze didn't falter. The other officer smirked and stepped in, leaning close before spitting again, this time at her feet, his voice laced with venom. "You think you're someone now? Just a maid who can read." The spit echoed in the narrow space, making the insult hit even harder in the night's silence. Maya stood still, breathing deep to suppress the fury surging inside. She stared straight into his eyes, her voice sharp as steel, each word cutting through the darkness. "I am a human being, not your toy." The words landed hard, flashing surprise across their faces for a split second before it turned to rage. One of them reached out to grab her shoulder, growling, "You've got some nerve." For a moment, the alley thickened with tension, the darkness pressing down on all three of them. Just as the rough hand was about to touch her, another voice cut through the air, cold and sharp. "That's enough." From the far end of the alley, a figure approached, tall and lean, walking with purpose. The light from a phone screen lit up a young face marked by quiet determination. It was Adrian Cole, a young lawyer known for defending the underprivileged. He had happened to walk by, and the moment he saw what was unfolding, he didn't hesitate. Adrian lifted his phone, hit record, and held it out in front of him, his voice steady. "Everything you're doing, I've got it all on record." The two officers froze, their eyes flashing with sudden caution. One let out a low, forced laugh, but it lacked the confidence from earlier. "Who the hell are you to butt in?" Adrian stepped forward, his gaze unwavering, cold and firm. "Adrian Cole, attorney. And I just recorded the entire exchange. If you continue, this evidence will go straight to court." His voice echoed down the alley, not loud, but sharp enough for each word to cut straight into the men facing him. Behind him, Maya felt a wave of warmth rise within. She had never met Adrian before, but in that moment, his presence felt like a shield, a lifeline in the middle of a storm. Adrian's icy stare clashed with the officer's aggression, and though his frame wasn't imposing, his confidence and the weight of his title shifted the balance of power. A tense silence fell over the alley, broken only by the faint sound of insects chirping. One of the officers clenched his jaw, muttering in a low, threatening tone, "Don't think that lawyer title scares us. This whole city knows Beckett has our backs." Adrian tilted his head slightly, a half-smile forming with cool contempt. "Even better, Beckett's name will only add weight to the evidence. Go on, continue. Let's see if you're still wearing that badge tomorrow after this hits social media." The words tightened the air even more, but they also threw the two officers off balance. They exchanged glances, then looked back at Maya, their eyes burning with hatred, but their hands slowly eased. One muttered a curse, then jerked his chin toward Adrian. "You're lucky tonight, lawyer. We'll let it go for now. But remember, Beckett doesn't forget." With that, both turned and retreated into the darkness, their silhouettes slipping behind the corner like two beasts driven back. Maya let out a breath, her legs so weak they nearly gave out beneath her. Adrian stepped forward quickly, gently steadying her by the arm. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low but warm. Maya gave a small nod, though her eyes still burned with resolve. "I've grown used to contempt, but this time, I don't want to get used to it." Adrian looked at her closely, as if he could see in her eyes a fire few could keep alive after being trampled. He closed his phone, slipped it into his pocket, and said firmly, "You're not alone anymore. They made a mistake thinking you would stay silent." In the darkness of the alley, the two stood side by side, one who had just endured humiliation, the other who had stepped in with courage to stop injustice. The night wind swept through, carrying the scent of smoke and dust from the main road. But here, a new sense of purpose had just been lit. Maya knew what lay ahead would be even more brutal, but with Adrian Cole's arrival, she also knew she no longer had to walk alone, and the confrontation in tonight's alley was only the beginning of a coming battle no one would be able to avoid. That morning, City Hall was packed, the air heavy with anticipation. After days of social media outrage, public pressure forced the city council to hold an emergency hearing. Outside, reporters jostled for position, protest signs were raised high, and crowds chanted for justice. Inside the chamber, Dozens of cameras pointed at the large screen at the center stage. The lights overhead made the room feel stifling, but the moment the video began playing, the silence was chilling. Frame by frame, Maya was shown being yanked down by police, her voice echoing, "He's afraid of the truth," and the flickering red light of the recording phone. Every sharp sound shouts. Heavy thuds rang out with unnerving clarity, like a knife slicing through the conscience of the room. The hall froze, then murmurs rippled through the crowd, mixed with rising, uncontrollable anger. Some raised their phones to record, others wept as they watched a scene of brutality all too familiar. The faces of police representatives in the front row turned pale as they tried to mask their discomfort, but the truth on screen could not be denied. The presiding official banged his gavel, demanding order, then turned his gaze to Maya Green, who stood by the witness stand. Maya stepped forward, her stride steadier than ever. She wore an old button-up shirt, but her eyes burned bright. As she looked out over the packed chamber, with hundreds waiting to hear her speak, she felt a weight on her shoulders, but it was no longer fear, it was responsibility. She began to speak, not loudly, not trembling, but with clarity and conviction. Maya recounted everything, from the moment Charles Beckett handed her the paper, to the mocking laughter that filled the boardroom, to the second she was slammed to the floor by police. Her voice was steady, skipping no details, each word like a hammer striking down on a long-standing lie. The room held its breath, listening intently. Maya did not embellish or ask for sympathy, she simply described what had happened. When she spoke of her father being beaten by police, her voice caught for a second, but her gaze quickly sharpened again. She spoke of her interrupted dream to study language, the grueling years spent working to support her family, and the moment she was forced to become a joke in Beckett's boardroom. Each story she told became a piece of a larger picture, where injustice was no longer hearsay but a visible, undeniable truth. In the audience, many couldn't hold back tears. Some mothers looked at Maya as if seeing their own daughters. Some young people clenched their fists in anger, and even seasoned reporters, used to daily headlines, scribbled quickly, afraid to miss a single detail. Maya ended with a line that shook the entire room. "If they could beat me that day, in front of dozens of people, how many others have been beaten in the dark, when no one dared to hit record?" That line hit straight to the heart. The room went silent for a few seconds, then the clapping began scattered at first, then pouring down like a rainstorm. The chairperson struck the gavel repeatedly to restore order, but no one could contain their emotion. Under the glaring lights, Maya stood tall, no longer the despised maid, but the living witness to the truth, the voice of those trampled for far too long. And in that moment, the public had their answer. Justice was no longer a distant idea. It had begun with the clear voice of a girl who dared to speak in front of everyone. Charles Beckett sat frozen, under the weight of hundreds of eyes boring into him, his face stiff, his hands trembling slightly on the table, though he tried to stay composed. The presiding councilman leaned into the mic, his voice echoing through the chamber, clear and firm. "Mr. Beckett, please answer plainly before the public. Do you intend to pay Miss Maya Green the full month's salary as you declared in the boardroom or not?" The question dropped like a hammer, freezing the room. Every camera lens pointed directly at him, a forest of reporters' mics held higher, keys clacking rapidly to capture every moment. Charles inhaled, throat tight, head spinning as he recalled the smug moment he had issued the challenge, now turned into a noose tying him to public scrutiny. A voice shouted from the gallery, "Answer the question." Then others followed, wave after wave. "Keep your word. Stop hiding." The crowd's outcry erupted into a chorus of fury, crashing against every wall of City Hall. One person held a sign that read, "Intelligence is not a joke," and another yelled, "Justice for Maya." The uproar was so intense the chair had to pound the Gannon stop-top, demanding silence, but it was no use, the public had slipped beyond control. Charles lowered his head, sweat breaking across his forehead, eyes avoiding the cameras now zooming in on his every twitch. The pressure came not only from the shouting, but also from the flood of messages on the large screen connected live to social media. The hashtag number Justice for Maya blinked non-stop, and tens of thousands of comments appeared as the hearing took place. People wrote, "If Beckett has any honor, he should keep his promise. A millionaire breaking his word to a maid. This is proof of the deceit of the powerful." Each line felt like a dagger to Charles's already fragile credibility, making it hard for him to breathe in the sea of people demanding he face his own words. Charles opened his mouth, but his throat was parched, his voice stuck. He looked toward Maya's row, where she sat quietly, eyes bright, shoulders upright, not a trace of fear. That contrast made Charles even more unsettled. He was used to getting what he wanted with a smirk or a glance, but now he was the one under judgment. Every passing second pressed the weight of public opinion down harder, leaving no space for the arrogance he once wore like armor. As the shouting swelled, Charles closed his eyes for a moment, searching for some justification, but every excuse he came up with would be torn apart instantly. The crowd didn't want spin, they wanted one thing only. Did he intend to keep his word or not? The entire chamber had become a pressure cooker, heat rising from the fury of hundreds surrounding him, cornering him. And in that moment, Charles realized all his power, wealth, and political connections meant nothing in the face of a single sentence he once mocked. The chants of "Justice, justice" echoed, rumbling from the streets into the chamber, merging with the chair's futile gavel strikes. The entire building shook with outrage, forcing Charles Beckett, the man who once believed himself untouchable, to sit still in a chair that used to symbolize authority, but now served only to trap him in a truth he could no longer escape. That morning, the courtroom had turned into a battlefield, every seat packed, reporters jostling, cameras stacked tightly to capture every moment. The air was heavy with anticipation. Each cough, each rustle of paper echoed clearly through the thick atmosphere. At the front, a line of microphones pointed toward the witness stand, where individuals came up one by one, including Maya Green, the woman who had stirred public outrage for days. The name Beckett was mentioned repeatedly, each time stirring the room, as everyone waited to see how far the power of a millionaire could shield him. The presiding judge struck the gavel hard, urging order, but the crowd outside the courthouse kept pushing forward, their chants of justice ringing endlessly, impossible to ignore. When it was time to question the police officers, the entire room felt breathless. Faces that once held cold confidence during the boardroom incident now looked pale under harsh lighting. The prosecutor stood tall, voice echoing, demanding the replay of the now viral audio recording. Each racist slur, each cruel insult played through the speakers with chilling clarity. "A black girl who can read. If you stutter, I'll knock you out." The words rang through the courtroom, sending shivers down spines. No one laughed. No one looked away. The officers sat hunched, hands trembling, muttering incoherently, but the evidence shone clear as midday Sunday. Reporters snapped photos in a frenzy, camera flashes bursting non-stop, capturing every moment of disgrace. Journalists typed feverishly, headlines forming in their minds. Truth laid bare in court, the words that exposed Beckett's protectors. Spectators whispered. Some clenched their jaws in anger, others shook their heads in sympathy for Maya, knowing how much she had endured to speak this truth. As the slurs played again, Maya's eyes burned with a steady light, no trace of fear left, because now the truth was no longer a solitary scream in a closed room, but public evidence before an entire society. From the bench, the judge struck the gavel firmly. Everything has been heard clearly, no need for argument. His voice cut through the tension, calming the room momentarily, though the heat of the moment remained. Across the room, Charles Beckett sat, his gaze adrift, his face pale. He once believed money could bend the world to his will, but the crowds shouting outside, the mounting evidence within, had closed in on him. Beckett glanced at Maya, and their eyes met hers steady and direct, no longer the look of a timid maid, but of a woman who had risen with intellect and pride to stand as his equal, if not above him. Each racist remark was replayed like a hammer striking down on dignity, smashing the shield of power that once protected those who openly belittled others. There was no way out, no place to hide. The truth had been laid bare before hundreds of people, under the lenses of cameras broadcasting live. And in that breathless tension, it felt as if the whole world spoke in unison, declaring that justice was being reclaimed, not through weapons or violence, but through words that seemed small yet carried enough force to shake an empire. Charles Beckett sat in the witness stand, his face gradually losing color as the offensive remarks echoed again, each word pronounced with clarity like a verdict. The entire courtroom watched him, and under that heavy pressure, Charles was speechless, his lips moving, but no sound coming out. Sweat poured down his forehead, streaming along his temples. His hands trembled as they gripped each other, and the expensive handkerchief in his palm was crumpled to shreds. He was once used to steering any situation with a smug smile or a subtle threat, but now all that power had been stripped away, leaving behind a man lost amid the storm of justice. Reporters turned their lenses on him, cameras flashing relentlessly, each burst of light stinging like salt on the open wound of a man who never imagined he would face such a day. The air in the room grew hotter, not from the weather, but from the mounting pressure of public outrage. People murmured, some let out dry, mocking laughs, others sighed in dismay, and all those sounds blended into a fierce, discordant symphony that made Charles even more flustered. A few spectators in the back row tapped on their desks, murmuring, "He's dodging," and those words were loud enough to reach his ears, causing him to bow his head even lower. He searched for a reason, an excuse to justify himself, but every attempt was blocked by the undeniable truth playing on the large screen. His heart pounded wildly, breath short and sharp, and never in his life had he felt so small. In the thick air of the courtroom, Maya Green stood tall at the witness stand, her figure rising above the crowd, her eyes locked on Charles, no longer showing fear or hesitation. Everything she had endured from the night in the poor tenement, the memory of her father being beaten, to the moment she was slammed to the floor in the Beckett boardroom came together in a voice that rang clear and unwavering through the room. "You cannot buy the truth." The words struck like a final blow, tearing apart the silence that had gripped the courtroom. She didn't need to raise her voice or offer further explanation. Every syllable carried enough weight to shake the room to its core. A wave surged through the crowd, applause erupting, at first scattered, then crashing like a waterfall. People stood up, shouting Maya's name, no longer concerned with maintaining order. The presiding judge struck the gavel several times, but eventually stopped, realizing that this was a moment when justice had been affirmed not by verdict, but by the moral strength of a woman who dared to stand. Charles raised a trembling hand to shield his eyes as flash after flash lit up the scene, capturing the stark contrast between a fallen figure of power and a maid who had become the voice of truth. In that moment, Maya was no longer just a witness. She had become a symbol of resilience and a reminder that truth cannot be buried by power or wealth. Every eye was fixed on her, not only with admiration but with belief that the small, resolute voice had opened a path toward a more just world. And as the echo of, "You cannot buy the truth," lingered in the air, everyone understood that from this day forward, the name Maya Green would be tied to a historic confrontation where intellect and dignity triumphed over arrogance and oppression. Immediately after the hearing, public opinion moved beyond social media calls for justice and turned into a direct wave aimed at the Beckett Corporation. In an emergency meeting, shareholders sat around a long walnut table, their faces grim. The digital board on the wall flashed with red numbers, Beckett International's stock price plummeting like a stone dropped into a deep ravine. The decline wasn't just market-driven. It came from the collapse of trust after the release of the video and Maya's testimony. An elderly shareholder, voice shaking with anger, slammed his hand on the table. "We invested in Beckett for its reputation and power, not to be dragged through the mud by Charles's out-of-control circus." Voices of agreement followed, no longer out of respect for the man who once led them, but out of outrage from those who felt their interests were now at risk. Meanwhile, the media kept digging into the wound. Major newspapers ran headlines like, "Beckett's power collapse," and "Beckett stock evaporates by hundreds of millions in 3 days." Op-eds bluntly questioned whether the company still deserved shareholder confidence now that its founder had become a symbol of arrogance and broken promises. On financial forums, investors debated heatedly, many announcing immediate withdrawals to avoid being caught in the whirlpool of scandal. Beckett, once a symbol of success, now stood on the brink of becoming a cautionary tale of collapse when ethics are abandoned. It wasn't just the financial sector that shook. Law enforcement was rattled as well. After the full audio recordings and footage were made public, the names of the officers present in that boardroom spread quickly, forcing the city's police department to suspend them immediately. Their images in uniform flooded the internet with sarcastic and furious captions. "Paid to protect citizens or serve the wealthy?" Public pressure mounted so intensely that police leadership had to hold a press conference. Facing a barrage of tough questions, the spokesperson was forced to admit there were signs of serious abuse of power and promised an independent investigation. Inside the force, many younger officers expressed frustration, believing the reckless actions of a few had tarnished the image of the entire department. One lieutenant told a television audience, "When we put on this uniform, we carry the duty to serve the community, but those actions betrayed that oath." His candid statement quickly spread across networks, further isolating the suspended officers in the public eye. Inside the vast mansion, Charles Beckett sat alone, his vacant gaze fixed on the television screen replaying the news. His image flashed between red headlines. "Beckett stock hits record low." He felt the power that once made others bow now, like a cracked crystal vase, fragile enough to shatter at the slightest touch. Calls from partners, from lawyers, from those who once spoke to him with deference were now laced with blame and veiled threats. The order Charles once believed unshakable was crumbling piece by piece. As for Maya, she paid no attention to stock prices or boardroom debates. She returned to her modest rented room, continuing to write in her journal, her eyes calm but resolute. She understood these fractures were not merely the downfall of a corporation or a few officers, but signs that change had begun. Voices once silenced were now being heard, and justice, however fragile, was finding its way through those cracks to shine a light. Maya Green's name appeared everywhere in newspapers, on evening news shows, and even on murals hastily painted on street corners. People saw her as a living symbol of resistance and intellect, someone who dared to stand tall in the storm of injustice. In the central square, groups gathered, holding signs with Maya's image and the quote that shook the entire city, "You can't buy the truth." Children wore shirts with her face. Students marched with books in hand, and workers stood silently after long shifts, watching the clip replayed on massive screens. their eyes misty, as if seeing themselves in her image. Everyone found a piece of their own story in Maya, from hardship to the hunger for recognition. On social media, the hashtag bearing her name continued to spread, not just nationally, but across other countries as well. Articles in French, Spanish, and Japanese quoted Maya's words, treating them as a declaration of human dignity. A well-known author wrote, "Sometimes, history changes not because of those in power, but because one underestimated person dared to speak amid the mockery." That sentence was shared hundreds of thousands of times, embedding Maya's image as a symbol that transcended race and status. While Maya was being celebrated, Charles Beckett faced an unprecedented isolation. The shareholders who once dined with him, raising glasses of expensive wine in his honor, now sent emails demanding his resignation, their words cold, as if years of association meant nothing. Some even boldly criticized him in the press, claiming that his arrogance and mishandling had severely damaged their collective interests. The lavish dinners, once customary among the elite, had turned into cold, empty evenings, as no one wanted their name associated with a man now seen as a symbol of disgrace. Politicians who had previously accepted donations from Beckett subtly distanced themselves. Some spoke on television, skirting around the topic with vague remarks about the need for social fairness. But behind those words was a quiet severing of ties with Charles. He could feel the familiar threads of connection unraveling, one ally after another pulling away, leaving him isolated. Phone calls went unanswered, and text messages received no reply. That silence weighed heavier than any accusation, for it confirmed that Charles had been pushed out of the very circle of power he once dominated. Inside the sprawling mansion, Charles wandered through empty rooms, walls adorned with priceless art that now reflected only his weary silhouette. He sank into his usual leather chair, gazing out at the perfectly trimmed lawn, but inside he felt a vast emptiness. He remembered the days when people gathered around him, treating his words as commands, and now, every ally had turned their back, leaving him to face the fury of public opinion alone. The loss he felt was not from financial failure or a plunging stock price, but from the abandonment of trust, something no amount of money could buy back. Meanwhile, Maya still lived in her small rented room, reading letters sent from strangers, each word of encouragement a fresh gust of strength. She never thought of herself as a symbol, but the movement had grown beyond her expectations. And as her name was chanted in the streets, while Beckett's was cursed aloud, the balance of power had shifted completely, signaling the beginning of a new chapter for two lives now moving in opposite directions. On a cool, clear morning, Maya returned to the university she had once had to leave behind. The familiar hallways stretched out before her, the scent of old books and wood, evoking memories of days spent in lecture halls. The blue sky made her steps feel light, but inside, she was filled with a mix of anticipation and unease. Years had passed, and now she returned, not as a poor student struggling to stay afloat, but as a witness who had shaken society to its core. The gatekeeper recognized her, his eyes filled with surprise before quickly turning into a smile, as if he already knew she had become the symbol everyone was talking about. As she entered the language department, Maya saw the board listing the professors' names, and one familiar name made her heart pause: Professor Samuel Harris. The teacher who had introduced her to the power of language, who had stayed after class to explain things when he saw her buried in books late into the night. Her feet carried her to his office, where sunlight streamed through the window onto stacks of books piled high. Professor Harris looked up, his aged eyes lighting up with surprise at the sight of Maya. There was a brief silence before he smiled, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I knew the day would come when you'd return." The two sat across from each other, their conversation flowing like a stream long blocked, finally finding release. Maya spoke of the years spent working hard, the weight of family obligations that had forced her to abandon her education, and the arduous journey she had just endured. Professor Harris listened intently, the deep lines in his face etched with admiration. Slowly, he pulled out an old file, turned to a page with Maya's name, and placed it in front of her. It was a list of students once nominated for an international scholarship that year, and Maya had been one of the standout names. The professor sighed. "You were so close to a door that led to a much larger world, but circumstances forced you to stop. I always believed you deserved it." Maya looked at the yellowed paper, a mix of regret and pride welling in her chest. She remembered the long nights, studying under dim light, pages filled with her meticulous notes, and the burning desire to see the world. Now, knowing she had once been recognized as gifted, her heart ached, but her resolve grew stronger. She smiled, her voice firm. "I lost that chance, but I believe there are still many doors ahead. I won't miss them again." Professor Harris nodded, his eyes reflecting trust, seeing not just the student from years ago but a woman who had grown through the storm. News of Maya's return to campus spread quickly among students, and many gathered at the library hoping to see her in person. They weren't just curious about the woman at the center of national attention, but wanted to hear her story directly. Standing before those young faces, Maya spoke of her interrupted dreams and unwavering persistence, affirming that knowledge is the only true path to fight injustice. Applause broke out, not for a celebrity, but for someone who had faced adversity and overcome it with dignity. That encounter didn't just encourage Maya. It also felt like the beginning of something new. She realized her journey of renewal wasn't only about standing up to Beckett or the police, but also about restoring faith in learning and planting seeds of hope for the next generation. As she stepped out through the campus gates, the setting sun cast a warm glow, and Maya felt as if she herself had been reborn, carrying strength from the past to face the long road ahead. As Maya's conversation with Professor Harris ended, the quiet hallway echoed with steady footsteps. Adrian Cole appeared, holding a thick file, his eyes calm yet resolute. He had followed Maya's story from the earliest days it went public, from the recording in that dark alley, to the hearing that shook the public. Now, Adrian approached not as a chance witness, but as a true ally. He spoke firmly, with respect. Maya, you need a long-term plan. You can't keep facing them battle by battle. I want to support you legally, not just now, but for everything ahead. Maya looked surprised, her eyes widening before softening slowly. After so many years of handling everything alone, enduring abuse and pressure from every direction, someone offering to stand beside her for the long haul brought a quiet warmth. Adrian placed the file on the table, filled with legal terms, class action case files, and strategies for dealing with Beckett's company if they tried to retaliate. He explained each point clearly, stressing that the truth had been exposed, but turning it into a lasting shift required a solid legal foundation. You're not just fighting for yourself, Adrian said, but for everyone who's going to walk this path after you. I want to make sure no one can silence that voice ever again. Maya listened in silence, her heart beating fast with emotion. She had never imagined she would receive backing from a young but fearless lawyer. Adrian's eyes held no pity, and it wasn't just curiosity, they reflected a genuine belief in her worth. Maya nodded gently, her voice low but firm. I don't know how far I'll go, but if you walk with me, I believe the road will be brighter. A slight smile crossed Adrian's lips, a shared understanding that needed no further promises. From that moment, Maya felt a new current of strength coursing through her veins. She remembered the books she had left unfinished, the lectures still echoing in her memory, and the international scholarship file Professor Harris had just shown her. All of it blended into a flame that reignited her belief in knowledge. She knew that knowledge was not just a door for herself, but a weapon to fight for and protect the vulnerable. The vow written in her old journal was no longer just a reminder to resist being trampled, it had become the start of a much larger mission. That day, as Maya stepped out of the campus gates, she held her head high. The blue sky stretched ahead like a symbol of her rising hopes. She was no longer a girl who ran and endured, but someone holding the chance to turn knowledge into a guiding light for future generations. Adrian walked beside her, their steps in sync, his face marked by resolve. In that moment, they both understood a new journey had truly begun, one where justice would not only be shouted in the streets, but defended through law and unshakable faith in the power of knowledge. Just days later, the name Maya Green appeared all over major television channels. A popular talk show invited scholars, journalists, and even business leaders to join a panel discussion, with the topic displayed boldly on screen. Maya Green, a language prodigy from a poor kitchen, footage of the maid in her plain uniform, eyes unwavering in the Beckett boardroom, was replayed multiple times, interspersed with clips of the translation that had left the entire room in stunned silence. The host spoke with excitement, asking directly, "Is this proof that talent can grow anywhere, even in the kitchens of those who serve?" The guests debated passionately, some praising Maya as a symbol of resilience, others emphasizing that this event could spark a broader conversation about social equity and access to education. Each comment added fuel to the fire burning in the public's mind. On social media, the hashtag #SalaryBet quickly crossed US borders and spread globally. People shared the story in many different languages: French, Korean, Arabic, and simple lines in their native tongues. Posts featured images of Maya alongside the quote, "You can't buy the truth," turning it into an icon, printed on posters, t-shirts, and spread through online campaigns. Within a week, #SalaryBet ranked among the top 3 global trending topics, drawing millions of shares and comments. Prestigious universities also joined in. Some professors published essays in academic journals, analyzing Maya's talent as proof that education should not be limited by background. A linguistics scholar from Oxford remarked, "Her translation is not only accurate in meaning, but precise in cultural depth, revealing exceptional comprehension." The quote was widely cited, further cementing Maya's image as a forgotten genius. Students in various countries created clubs named after her, where they studied languages together and shared the inspiration that knowledge can transform lives. Alongside the praise, several news channels explored the issue from a social angle, Investigative programs dug into the question, what forced a gifted young woman to become a maid? Reporters visited her old boarding house, interviewing neighbors who spoke of a girl who worked endlessly by day and secretly read books at night. That image stood in stark contrast to the luxury of the Beckett boardroom, deepening the public's empathy. A major newspaper ran the headline, "From a poor kitchen to a global symbol of justice." The headline was shared millions of times, each share accompanied by messages of encouragement and admiration for Maya. Amid the media storm, Maya remained quiet. She turned down many flashy invitations, choosing instead to focus on her work with Adrian Cole to prepare the next legal steps. Yet her image did not fade, it grew brighter through restraint. People praised her composure as proof that she was not swept up by the spotlight but remained grounded in truth and justice. This only deepened public trust, as they saw in her an authentic symbol, untouched by media manipulation. While global opinion hailed Maya, Charles Beckett sank into crisis. He sat in a dark room, reading article after article, hashtags flooding his screen, feeling his reputation and power slip away. Each day brought more losses in allies, while Maya was lifted up by the world as a symbol. The contrast made it clear that a new era was taking shape, one where the voice of someone once dismissed could shake the foundations, even rise beyond the reach of the wealthiest. At the center of that wave, Maya Green burned brightly like a flame that had never expected to blaze so fiercely. In the city's major squares, groups of students and young people gathered with books, phones, and pages covered in characters from different languages. They turned once busy streets into spontaneous stages, where collective translation performances took place with energy. One group shouted quotes in French, another answered in Spanish, then all cheered when their translations matched. Curious bystanders joined in, offering simple sentences in their own languages, amazed to see the crowd respond in perfect rhythm. The media dubbed it a translation flash mob, a movement born from inspiration around Maya Green, and in just a few days, it spread to other cities, becoming a new cultural wave. Videos of these flash mobs were shared non-stop, tying Maya's image to the spirit of learning and resistance through knowledge. People chanted her name over music, raised signs with the quote, "You can't buy the truth," and laughed as children eagerly repeated foreign words like a fun game. These scenes led many commentators to say that never before had social change begun in a way so simple yet so powerful, from raising one's voice to affirm that everyone deserves access to and mastery over language. While the streets came alive with the vibrant colors of a new movement, Charles Beckett faced a completely different reality. He had just stepped out of a luxury hotel, his steps heavy from a series of tense closed-door meetings, when he was immediately surrounded by a long line of reporters. Microphones were pushed close to his face, and a barrage of rapid-fire questions left no room to respond. "Mr. Beckett, do you admit to challenging Maya Green? Do you intend to follow through on your promise to pay the $27,400? What do you think about your name being tied to this scandal?" The flash of cameras lit up relentlessly, making his face appear pale, his eyes lost in the chaos. Charles tried to avoid them, raising his hand to shield his face, but the reporters did not let up. They pushed closer, cameras pressed in, and each question landed like a hammer blow against his already fractured reputation. A young reporter raised his voice. "Do you think Maya Green deserves to be seen as a symbol, while you are remembered only as someone who broke his promise?" That question stunned Charles. His throat tightened, his lips moved, but no words came out. For a few seconds, he seemed completely exposed before the lenses, no longer the arrogant millionaire, but a man lost and overwhelmed by the public he once dismissed. That image was broadcast live on television, sparking a wave of intense commentary. Viewers no longer saw a powerful Beckett, only a man bewildered by the truth. While outside, crowds at flash mobs continued to chant with joyful translations, turning knowledge into a shared celebration. Charles Beckett drowned in a sea of microphones and lights, with no escape but to accept that the age of arrogance had come to an end. While Maya Green's name continued to dominate the media, one special announcement stirred public excitement. The organizers of the International Conference on Linguistics officially invited her to speak at the opening session. This prestigious event gathered scholars, researchers, and translators from around the world, a place Maya had once only dreamed of attending as a quiet listener, never imagining she might one day stand on the main stage. The invitation, stamped with a formal red seal, was delivered to her in person, along with a note, "We hope you will share your story and your belief in the power of language." As she read those words, Maya went silent for a few minutes, feeling that all the unfinished years of study and countless sacrifices had been acknowledged by a life-changing opportunity. On the day of the conference, the grand hall unfolded in full splendor, with rows of deep red velvet seats stretching across the floor and ceiling lights, casting a glow that made the space feel both solemn and brilliant. Behind the podium, a large backdrop displayed the theme, "Language and Human Dignity in the Modern World." Hundreds of international scholars filled the room, their hushed conversations blending with the soft sound of turning pages, all waiting for Maya's speech. The woman, the press had dubbed, the language prodigy from a poor kitchen. The air was both formal and charged with curiosity, as no one knew what the young former maid would say before some of the world's top intellectuals. As Maya stepped onto the stage, spotlights hit her eyes briefly. Applause thundered through the hall, not only as a welcome but as a recognition of her journey. She wore a simple ash-gray dress, her hair neatly tied back, her face calm and composed. She placed her hand on the microphone, took a deep breath, and let her gaze sweep across the room. In that moment, Maya saw herself years ago, sitting in a small classroom, yearning for the chance to be in this very place. Now, she was no longer the dropout student, but the central figure in a story that had reached across the globe. Her voice rang out, steady and clear. Language is not just a tool for communication. It is a bridge connecting people to dignity and truth. I learned that not in a lecture hall, but in moments of ridicule, rejection, and being thrown to the ground. It was in the darkest place that I realized intellect cannot be stripped away. Each word felt like an arrow striking directly into the minds of the audience. Scholars nodded gently, eyes fixed on her, while the international press typed furiously to capture every sentence. Maya went on to speak about the power of knowledge, how it could shift the balance of power. She spoke of how language opened doors to dialogue among people of different classes, races, and backgrounds, and that language never belongs to a few, but is a shared treasure of all humanity. When she declared, knowledge is the most enduring form of power, because it cannot be bought, and it cannot be hidden, the hall erupted into waves of applause. As Maya ended her speech, she bowed in gratitude. The spotlight cast her silhouette like a portrait of a journey, from a poor kitchen to a prestigious stage. In that moment, it wasn't just Maya who was honored, but the voice of everyone who had ever been dismissed, silenced, or overlooked. The magnificent, glowing hall became proof that justice and knowledge, when combined, could lift a person from the lowest depths to a place no one ever imagined. While Maya was receiving thunderous applause, a group of unfamiliar men quietly entered from the back of the hall. They wore formal suits and fake guest badges, walking calmly like regular delegates, but their cold eyes and awkward movements didn't escape the notice of the observant. There were 3 police officers who had been suspended after the hearing, now disguised to infiltrate the conference, aiming to disrupt and discredit Maya. One of them pulled a sheet of paper from his pocket, covered in dense foreign characters, mouthing words as if preparing to step up and turn the speech into a mockery. The room was still echoing with applause, unaware of the threat approaching, until Adrian Cole, seated in the front row, slightly turned his head. His instincts, sharpened by years of facing tense situations as a lawyer, immediately sensed something off. His eyes locked with the glare of one of the men, and in an instant, he understood their intent. Without hesitation, Adrian rose, moved quickly into the aisle, and his firm voice cut through the noise. "You have no right to be here." The entire room paused, and the stage lights focused on the suspicious group. One of the officers growled, "We just want to ask a question. This is a free forum, isn't it?" His words sounded like a trap, meant to twist the conference into a stage for publicly humiliating Maya. But Adrian didn't back down. He raised his legal badge, voice steady and strong. "A free forum doesn't mean a platform for violence and deceit. I know who you are, and I have proof you never registered to attend." The atmosphere grew thick with tension. Live television cameras quickly turned toward the group, causing them to falter. Some in the audience began whispering, and others looked alarmed or outraged. Maya stood at the podium, eyes locked on the scene, her hands clenched but unmoving. She knew Adrian was doing what had to be done, and this moment could decide whether the conference would become a disgrace or a testament to the defense of justice. Another officer stepped forward angrily, voice defiant. "How do you plan to stop us? We have the right to speak." Adrian took one more step, his gaze sharp as a blade, his voice low but clear. "The right to speak doesn't include the right to disrupt. One more step, and I'll consider this obstruction and expose each of your identities to the entire international audience watching right now." His words silenced the room, because everyone knew the television cameras were broadcasting live to millions of viewers around the world. The group of officers hesitated, their eyes darting around, searching for an escape. But Adrian's unwavering stare, and the outrage in the audience's eyes, made it clear that any move they made would instantly become evidence against them. A long, tense moment passed before they turned and walked away, their heavy steps echoing with humiliation. Adrian remained in the aisle, watching until their figures disappeared completely. The room erupted in applause, not only for Maya but also for Adrian, who had stepped in just in time to stop the disruption. Maya looked down, caught his eyes, and in that instant, she felt that this partnership was a solid anchor for the road ahead. The hall's brilliant lights reflected on both their faces, and the tension they had just overcome became one more testament that justice, though often challenged, still had people willing to stand up and protect it in the public eye. While Maya was being welcomed at the linguistics conference with the respect of scholars and a global audience, in a hidden corner of the city, confidential files were being unearthed by investigative journalists. A series of financial records, contracts, and transfer documents revealed that Charles Beckett had secretly invested in an international translation company. This investment had never been disclosed, and many shareholders within the Beckett Corporation were unaware of it. Outwardly, he had mocked language, ridiculed Maya, and turned translation into a joke, but behind closed doors, he was trying to manipulate the translation market for profit from the very field he publicly deemed worthless. The news spread quickly, fueling public outrage as it exposed the blatant contradiction between Beckett's words and actions. The press dug deeper, and evidence gradually revealed his scheme. After Maya unexpectedly delivered a fluent translation and gained public praise, Charles devised a covert plan to capitalize on her image to promote the translation company he had invested in. A leaked email from his close assistant showed Beckett had written, "If we can control Maya, we can turn her into the perfect PR tool. The image of a poor maid rising up will fool the public, while the profits flow into our pockets." Those chilling words were aired on television, igniting nationwide fury. People no longer saw a fallen businessman struggling to recover, but instead, the predatory face of a man willing to exploit anyone for gain. His attempt to turn Maya into a PR puppet was met with fierce backlash. Those who once admired Charles for his business acumen now turned their backs en masse. Some analysts noted that, had the plan succeeded, Beckett wouldn't just have restored his reputation, but would have monopolized the global translation market. But Maya wasn't a pawn he could control, and the timely presence of Adrian Cole and their allies dismantled the scheme from the outset. Public admiration for Maya only deepened, as people clearly saw she couldn't be bought with promises or lucrative deals, but instead stood firm in her independence, protecting the truth. In televised forums, many experts commented that Charles's hidden investment proved he never truly valued the human side of knowledge, viewing it only as a commodity to exploit. The image of him once arrogantly seated in the boardroom, daring Maya to translate a document, was now placed side by side with his investment contracts, exposing his hypocrisy. A major shareholder of Beckett International, interviewed by the press, stated bluntly, "We can no longer stand by a leader who not only breaks promises but also conspires to exploit others for personal gain." Maya followed all the news in silence. She understood that what had just been exposed was not only proof of Charles's deceit, but also validation of her own choice not to be swayed by money. Looking back, she knew the road ahead would be long and full of challenges, but the light of truth was once again on her side. And as more documents continued to surface, Beckett's image crumbled like a mask falling off, revealing the true face of a schemer, while Maya was increasingly recognized as an independent voice, a symbol of freedom and resolve. When the media released the first documents about Charles Beckett's secret investment, the last line of defense he had tried to build collapsed. Contracts and internal emails were broadcast live on television, like blades cutting into what remained of his fractured dignity. The public no longer had to speculate. They saw the numbers and the words confirming that Charles had secretly controlled a translation company while planning to turn Maya Green into a promotional tool. Once, Charles had seen himself as a master strategist, able to manipulate any situation with money and tactics. But now the truth was revealed, and the entire scheme collapsed like a sandcastle hit by a crashing wave. Public backlash erupted with unprecedented intensity. International news channels ran headlines like "Beckett falls to the truth" and "Dirty PR scheme exposed." Social media exploded with criticism, and many compared Charles to disgraced conmen from history. Investors pulled out en masse. Partners publicly severed ties, and those who once praised him as a business icon issued apologies for placing their trust in the wrong person. The image of power Charles had built for himself was erased within days, and the proud millionaire became a bitter punchline. Amid the storm, Maya remained calm. She and Adrian Cole had prepared thoroughly, holding in their hands critical documents provided by an anonymous former employee of Beckett International. The evidence included money transfer records, secret profit-sharing communications, and even a detailed plan outlining how Maya's image would be used in promotional campaigns. When Adrian laid the thick stack of papers before her, Maya felt as if she were holding the key that would throw open the door to the truth. At a press conference, Maya publicly presented the evidence for the first time. Her voice was calm but firm, and every sentence silenced the room. She explained that it wasn't just about her, but that many others could have become victims if the scheme had succeeded. "This isn't about one individual," Maya emphasized. "This is proof of how power can be abused to manipulate an entire society." On the large screen behind her, the documents were clearly projected, each shady transaction by Beckett scrolling past as viewers looked on in disbelief. The image of Maya holding the stack of documents, her eyes resolute, became a new iconic moment. The press called it the turning point, while commentators noted that never before had a housemaid stood at the center of a hall and presented evidence powerful enough to bring a corporate empire to its knees. Every attempt to turn Maya into a PR puppet has now backfired, becoming proof of Charles's greed and deceit. Charles Beckett sat in a dark room, watching the news broadcast, showing Maya raising the papers, his eyes vacant. He understood that everything he had worked to conceal had now been completely exposed, with no way to recover. Each page was like a nail in the coffin of his authority, and for the first time in his life, he felt himself pushed into a shadowy corner, stripped of the spotlight that once protected him. While he sank into the darkness of his downfall, Maya stood tall in the light, her hand clutching the evidence, embodying the power of truth that no force could silence. After the shock of Charles Beckett's covert scheme being exposed, the press didn't stop at reporting a personal scandal, but launched broader investigations. Reputable newspapers published a series of in-depth articles that shed light on a years-long protection network, where certain police officers had secretly colluded with the elite to preserve power and profit. The evidence came not only from Beckett International's internal documents, but also from interviews with people who had been suppressed, including small business owners, immigrant workers, and former employees who had witnessed the collusion firsthand. The public was stunned as they read each figure, each transaction record, all pointing to a reality where the police had strayed from their duty to protect citizens and had instead become tools in the hands of the wealthy. Television networks aired special programs where journalists sat face-to-face with witnesses recounting how they had been threatened by the police, coerced into silence when they dared to speak out against injustice. Each story was a piece of a puzzle, together forming a grim picture of an entire system under manipulation. In the midst of these investigative features, the name Maya Green stood out as a central witness, someone who had directly endured being dragged from a conference room, threatened in a dark alley, yet remained unyielding. When the investigative authorities officially opened the case, Maya was invited to testify. She entered the interrogation room, no longer timid as she once was, but calm, shaped by the trials she had endured. Facing her were seasoned investigators posing a series of questions to reconstruct the entire sequence of events. Maya recounted every detail, from the moment Charles threw the translation paper onto the table, to the mocking laughter that followed, and the forceful pull of the officers that knocked her down. Her voice was steady, unhesitant, as if the memories had been etched deeply, needing only a touch to surface vividly. Maya's presence didn't just supplement the evidence. It became a key element in exposing the protection network. She named each officer, described their behavior, and highlighted the moment when an anonymous witness had managed to record the incident on video. The consistency between Maya's testimony and the footage led investigators to conclude the case could not be dismissed. Numerous headlines praised her, calling her the light guiding through the maze of corruption. At public hearings, Maya appeared again, this time no longer alone but supported by lawyers and backed by hundreds of citizens outside the courthouse. They chanted her name, raised banners, and turned every step she took into a symbol of public encouragement. Though the pressure was immense, Maya held firm, and with each answer she gave, another layer of deception built by the protection network was stripped away. Maya's involvement brought the investigation to a turning point. Several officers who had been suspended were now forced to stand trial, and powerful figures who had long operated in the shadows were gradually exposed. Charles Beckett, despite every effort to deny wrongdoing, could not escape the truth once his shady financial transactions were matched against Maya's testimony. Society looked on and saw clearly that when enough people stand up for the truth, it can dismantle even the most seemingly unshakable systems. And at the heart of that upheaval, Maya Green was not just a witness but a symbol of resolve, proving that justice, though delayed, can still find its way into the light. The investigations expanded, not only uncovering the police protection network but also digging deep into Charles Beckett's financial operations. Newspapers published records of suspicious transfers from his accounts to shady investment funds located in tax havens. Financial analysts confirmed this as clear evidence of money laundering through a web of translation companies and fabricated contracts. As the names of shell companies were released to the public, Beckett's image as a successful figure crumbled completely, replaced by the portrait of a financial manipulator who used power to conceal misconduct. The federal court quickly intervened, ordering the seizure of assets and freezing several accounts connected to him. Lawyers representing Beckett scrambled to offer explanations, but against the clear trail of money flowing between shell corporations, their defenses appeared feeble. The image of a once proud millionaire presiding over boardrooms now flashed across television screens as a man under investigation, hurrying through crowds of reporters, face gaunt, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. Every financial broadcast that mentioned his name was now accompanied by words like scandal or fraud, and the credibility Charles had built over decades turned to ashes in a matter of weeks. Meanwhile, the allies who once stood behind him began revealing their true faces. Several politicians who had accepted funding from Beckett were placed under watch, and the murky ties between business elites and law enforcement slowly came to light. With each passing day, another dark corner was torn open, leading to large-scale arrests and interrogations. Human rights organizations called it a rare turning point, when corrupt power was pushed back by the persistence of one individual brave enough to speak the truth. International media didn't miss the chance to report on the case, framing it as a symbol of the battle between citizens and a corrupt elite. Long-form articles described Beckett's staggering presence in front of cameras while breaking down the collapse of his underground network piece by piece. Experts commented that the system had existed too long in the shadows, but once the light shone in, every corner was exposed, and nothing could stop the chain reaction of downfall. For Maya, she followed the news from her small room. Each new report, a sign that the words she had spoken with conviction hadn't vanished into a void. She understood that justice doesn't arrive in a single day, but each collapse was the result of what she and many others had bravely stood up to confront. As layers of corruption were peeled away, Maya realized her journey wasn't just about defending personal dignity, but about opening a space for those who had long lived in silence to finally speak out. And in the broader picture, the image of Charles Beckett being pulled into a whirlwind of financial scandal was no longer one of a central power figure, but of arrogance finally being held to account. At the same time, each link in the chain of corruption weakened, collapsing like rotting walls, proving that no force can remain standing forever against the power of truth. The news of the expanded investigation and the collapse of Beckett's empire made Maya a celebrated name, but also turned her into a dangerous target. Late one night, while the rundown apartment complex lay quiet, the shadows of several unfamiliar men appeared outside the row of units. They wore no uniforms, but their voices and the air of authority mirrored those who once dragged her from the boardroom. Heavy footsteps echoed on the concrete. Then suddenly, a powerful kick shattered the flimsy wooden door to Maya's room. The tiny space, barely large enough for a bed, an old desk, and a bookshelf, shook violently under the force of the invasion. Maya jolted awake, heart pounding, as she saw two suspended police officers standing before her, their eyes full of hatred. They kicked over the stacks of books, pages flying wildly in chaos. One of them shouted, "You think you can bring Beckett down and still live peacefully here?" His fist slammed into the wall, leaving a dent, making Maya tremble briefly, but her eyes quickly hardened. Years of enduring humiliation had taught her that fear never stops the enemy. The noise of destruction woke the whole complex. Neighbors peeked out, terrified but hesitant to act. An elderly woman next door shakily dialed for help, her voice breaking in panic. Children wailed, their cries mingling with the sound of splintering wood into a haunting echo. Maya was cornered, but instead of pleading, she shouted, her voice hoarse yet fierce. "The more you do this, the more people will know the truth." Her scream pierced the night, sending a shiver down the entire building. One of the officers, furious, grabbed a wooden chair, ready to strike. When the door swung open again, neighbors began to emerge, first a few, then a growing crowd carrying flashlights and sticks, eyes tense but firm. A middle-aged man shouted, "We've called the press and independent police. If you touch her again, the whole city will know." Surrounded by witnesses, the two intruders hesitated, their confusion plain in their eyes. Maya was helped to her feet, her face still marked by fear, but her gaze unbroken. She knew these men hadn't come to end the story, only to spread terror and force her into silence. But the sight of people stepping out of their rooms, standing beside her in that critical moment, ignited a fire in her chest. She looked straight at the two officers, her voice steady. "I'm not alone, and the truth will not be buried in this darkness." The two men hurled a few curses and backed out, their footsteps echoing through the narrow, dark hallway, leaving behind a wrecked room and tense stares. As they disappeared, many neighbors still hadn't recovered from the shock, but everyone understood they had just witnessed a desperate attempt to silence Maya. The air was thick with outrage. A few young people pulled out their phones to record the scene, determined to spread the footage so the entire city could see who was using violence to suppress the truth. That night, Maya sat in the middle of her shattered room, books scattered everywhere, her hands still trembling, but her eyes blazing. She knew the danger wasn't over, yet she also realized that the more she was attacked, the stronger her story became. Darkness could threaten her, but the light of the community's belief was rising, one spark at a time, to protect her and prove that once the truth speaks, no force can crush it. Maya had been pushed against the wall, the sound of destruction still echoing through the cramped apartment, the chaos making it hard to believe this was once a peaceful place. Her frame seemed small in the dark, but her voice rang out suddenly, powerfully, cutting through the rage of the intruders. "You can't kill the truth." Her scream shot down the hallway, through the thin walls, silencing the building for a moment. The words weren't only for the two men before her, but for anyone lurking in the dark, hoping to smother her voice. Maya's voice, though hoarse, was firm, awakening courage in those who had long lived in fear, changing the atmosphere in a single breath. From behind wooden doors, noises began to stir at first, tentative footsteps. Then the firm sound of doors swinging open. The first neighbor stepped out, holding a bamboo stick, his eyes filled with worry, refusing to retreat. A moment later, another door flew open, revealing a young mother cradling her child. Her eyes still wide with fear but her voice shaking as she said, "We can't leave her alone." Her simple words became a signal that awakened the hallway. Doors once tightly shut now opened one by one, men and women stepping out, even children peeking from behind their parents, their flashlights and phone screens casting small beams that lit up the dark. The two disguised officers froze for a moment. They were used to operating under the silence of fearful civilians, but now the entire community was stepping forward. A middle-aged man, his face weathered from hard labor, moved to stand between Maya and the intruders, his voice firm. "If you want to get to her, you'll have to go through us first." His words were met with applause, with voices rising in unison around him. The sudden wave of solidarity left the two men unsettled, their eyes darting, searching for an escape. The damp alleyway suddenly lit up like a wall of unwavering people. Young men stood in rows holding sticks. Women filmed the entire scene with their phones, and the sound of recording clicks reminded the two intruders that any move they made would be exposed. An elderly woman slowly stepped forward, her hands trembling but eyes blazing, and said loudly, "We've endured too much. From today on, no one has the right to treat us like garbage anymore." Cheers erupted across the housing block, overpowering the aggression, turning Maya from a lone figure into the heart of a united force. The two officers began retreating, muttering curses under their breath, but it was clear they had lost. The image of neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder, from the elderly to young children, from weathered faces to shining eyes, became living proof of solidarity. Maya was helped to her feet, her eyes glistening as she looked around and realized that in that moment, the entire community had risen, no longer scattered individuals, but a single unified front. Fear had been shattered by willpower, and that alone had protected her more strongly than any wall ever could. That night, the narrow alley was no longer a dark corner. It lit up with flashlight beams, phone screens, and the fire of determination burning in the hearts of the people. Maya's shout, "You can't kill the truth," became a chant passed from person to person, repeated until it echoed across the neighborhood. The event not only saved Maya from danger, but also changed the mindset of the entire community, turning fear into strength and silence into a collective voice. From that point on, Maya was no longer just an individual standing against a dark force, but a guiding symbol for a community that had rediscovered its faith in justice and truth. Charles Beckett sat alone in his luxurious office, now cold and silent. The valuable paintings on the walls, the expensive liquor in glass cabinets, and the walnut furniture no longer brought him pride. Everything only reminded him of a time when power was slipping from his grasp. The financial report in front of him showed glaring red numbers. Beckett International's stocks were in freefall. Major contracts had been cancelled, one after another, and several projects were frozen under investigation. Bankruptcy was no longer a threat. It had become a reality, closing in around Charles, suffocating him. His phone rang constantly, but most calls came from creditors, angry shareholders, or lawyers warning that there was almost no chance of recovery. Charles, once a man unfamiliar with defeat, now felt like a sinking ship in a storm. As the company collapsed, Charles was drawn into another, more dangerous vortex. The police officers who once protected him were now under investigation and suspension, but instead of taking the fall, they sought to drag him down with them. One evening, as Charles left the office building, two plainclothesmen blocked him in the parking garage. Their posture was familiar, eyes threatening, and their coarse voices told him everything. One leaned in and whispered in a voice cold as steel, "You'll testify exactly as we instruct, or you and your family won't be safe." Charles froze, cold sweat running down his spine, realizing he had just become a hostage in the hands of those who once called him boss. In the days that followed, Charles received prepared statements, demanding that he read them aloud during hearings. The content was riddled with lies, meant to cover up the crimes of the officers, while shifting blame to other associates. Charles knew that signing them would be perjury, adding heavier charges to his name, but refusing meant facing ruthless retaliation from men who had nothing left to lose. Night after night, he paced sleeplessly through his dark mansion, eyes bloodshot, mind spinning between two equally destructive choices. Feeling cornered, Charles began to reflect on the damage he had caused. He remembered sitting smugly in the boardroom, sneering at Maya and tossing the translated document on the table. That moment had become a painful scar, the trigger for the chain of events that dragged him into ruin. His arrogance, greed, and blind faith in power had become shackles. Charles understood that whether he signed or not, the road ahead was cloaked in darkness, and the Beckett name no longer served as the shield it once was. The news in the papers each day only made things worse. Images of Maya, standing firm during the hearings, holding clear evidence in her hands, were spread everywhere. Meanwhile, images of Charles surrounded by reporters, dodging questions, became the portrait of a man who had once stood at the top but was now drowning in scandal. The more he tried to cover things up, the deeper he sank. And now, being forced to commit perjury by the very officers who once served him, Charles realized he had reached a crossroads where no path led to safety, only risky steps toward the edge of a cliff. In the darkness of collapse, Charles Beckett understood that the price of arrogance was not just money or reputation, but life under threat and freedom hanging by a thread. The road he had walked with the belief that power could buy everything had brought him to a cold reality. Power could not save a man who had lost the truth. Charles Beckett sat in a dark room, the desk lamp casting light on a stack of documents piled high on the wooden surface. The forged statements sent by the police, still carrying the smell of cigarette smoke. He stared at the lines of text, his hand trembling slightly, sweat gathering despite the air conditioner running at full blast. Two opposing voices echoed in his head, one urging him to sign and hold on to the last fragments of power, the other whispering that one more lie would make him a man with no path back. For years, Charles had lived in a world where gain always won, but now, cornered by conscience, he saw clearly the gap between manipulation and truth. Each time he picked up the pen, he put it down again, knowing those lines would not only seal the fate of others but also lock away his own future. In that moment, a memory of Lucas, his only son, rose vividly in his mind. Lucas was just 14, living with his mother in another city after the marriage had fallen apart. Charles rarely spent time with him, choosing instead to send financial support and continue chasing deals and lavish parties. But recently, as the scandal dominated the airwaves, he received a photo from his ex-wife showing Lucas sitting in front of the TV, his face stunned as he watched his father surrounded by reporters. That image haunted Charles, stealing sleep from his nights. He wondered, in his son's eyes, who he was a role model to look up to, or a liar who made his child lower his head in shame in front of friends. One afternoon, as he was leaving the courtroom, Charles unexpectedly saw Lucas standing in the hallway. The boy was with his mother, but had insisted on staying back to say a few words to him. Lucas's eyes were bright, yet full of disappointment, and he quietly said, "I don't care about the money. I just want to know if you're telling the truth." That short question echoed in Charles's heart, louder than any threats from the police, leaving him speechless. His entire life, he had believed that money could cover any mistake, but now his son's gaze revealed that the truth could not be bought. From that moment on, Charles began to waver. He spent hours in his office, staring at a photo of Lucas placed on his desk, the boy smiling brightly on his first day of school. That innocent look reminded him of the responsibility he had long neglected. He realized that if he signed the false statement, he might extend his grip on power for a few more days, but he would permanently lose the fragile trust Lucas still had in him. And if he chose to tell the truth, even if it meant losing everything, he could at least preserve the image of a father willing to bow before justice. The struggle between self-interest and conscience tormented him hour by hour. Charles walked the courthouse corridors, Lucas's voice still echoing in his ears. That simple yet weighty question, "Are you telling the truth?" It made every step heavier, yet also cracked open a sliver of light in a mind long overshadowed by darkness. For the first time, Charles Beckett began to believe that the path to redemption might not lie in power, but in the courage to face the truth so that Lucas could one day lift his head proudly when calling him Dad. On the day of the final hearing, it felt as though the entire city came to a standstill. In front of the federal courthouse, thousands of citizens gathered, raising banners and chanting slogans in support of justice. Rows of news vans lined both sides of the street, cameras aimed directly at the grand entrance. As this time, the entire proceeding was broadcast live on national television. Inside, the courtroom was packed, every seat filled by scholars, lawyers, students, and ordinary people, waiting for the moment when truth would finally speak. On the massive screen hanging in the courtroom, a line scrolled across, "The final trial. Will justice prevail?" heightening the tension even further. Maya Green entered, her figure small but her gaze unwavering. The lights cast her shadow long across the floor, an image both fragile and powerful. Everyone watched in silence as she stepped up to the witness stand, clutching a stack of documents and her old laptop. These weren't just papers, they were the evidence she and Adrian Cole had spent months collecting. Maya took a breath, then opened the laptop, connecting it directly to the large projection screen. Chinese characters appeared the very document Charles once tossed aside to mock her. Maya began translating, each sentence delivered clearly, fluently, without pause. Her voice was firm and sharp, translating and explaining grammar structures and historical context, as if she were teaching a class. She asserted that this was not luck, nor a memory trick, but the result of years of dedicated study and perseverance. Her live translation was broadcast across the nation, watched by millions at home, and everyone could now see Maya's true capability. A video followed, showing Maya once teaching a group of children in her neighborhood, guiding them through the alphabet, correcting their pronunciation, and encouraging them to explore new languages. The scene moved the entire courtroom, as it proved that Maya didn't just know how to translate a document, she lived with knowledge, and passed it on to the next generation. Looking straight into the camera, her voice rang out strong and clear. "I'm not here to ask for sympathy. I'm here to prove that a person's worth doesn't lie in their social status, but in the effort and knowledge they carry." Thunderous applause erupted, despite the judge banging his gavel repeatedly to restore order. On the live broadcast, comment sections overflowed with messages. "She already won right here. This is justice." Analysts covering the trial unanimously confirmed Maya's undeniable ability. A renowned scholar exclaimed, "This is a historic moment, when someone once dismissed has used knowledge itself to turn power on its head." Across the room, Charles Beckett sat silently, his face pale. He bowed his head, fingers interlocked, knowing that every effort to deny the truth had completely collapsed. The police officers, who were once his allies, kept their heads down, avoiding the contemptuous stares of the audience. The entire power network that once seemed untouchable had now disintegrated under the light of truth. The trial continued with tense legal arguments, but from the moment Maya presented her evidence and translated live before millions, public opinion had already shifted. No one saw a humiliated maid anymore. They saw a scholar, a warrior of knowledge, asserting herself at the heart of justice. And from that moment, the world understood that the real verdict had already been delivered in the hearts of those witnessing it, that truth could neither be bought nor silenced. As Maya finished presenting the evidence and the courtroom erupted in applause, a sudden silence fell. All eyes turned to Charles Beckett, seated on the opposite side, his face ghostly white, his eyes vacant. Slowly, he stood up, one trembling hand gripping the back of the chair for balance. The courtroom held its breath, as no one expected the man who once scoffed at everything to rise in a gesture of surrender. Charles's voice was hoarse, but loud enough to echo through the courtroom. I was wrong. I apologize to Maya Green and to everyone who believed in justice." The words landed like a thunderclap, as reporters raised their cameras, capturing the historic moment when a powerful millionaire bowed before the maid he once mocked. A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. There was a smattering of applause, quickly overtaken by whispered discussions. Many said the apology came too late, that it was merely a last-ditch attempt to salvage his dignity. But no one could deny that the public act of contrition shattered the arrogant mask Charles had worn for so long. Maya looked directly at him, her gaze calm and steady, not filled with hatred but with a quiet composure, as if to show that she needed no revenge. Truth had done that for her. While Charles bowed his head, the police officers who once stood by him had no escape. The prosecutor read aloud each charge, while the large screen replayed audio of their racist remarks and footage of them dragging Maya out of the conference room. Outrage erupted throughout the gallery, voices shouting non-stop, "Fire them now. They must pay for their crimes." The back rows shook with fury as people stood, pointing directly at those who had once worn the badge of justice, only to betray its very purpose. The officers sat frozen, heads bowed, shoulders trembling under immense pressure. One of them broke down, slumping over the table, hands covering his face as sweat dripped onto the wooden floor, leaving dark stains. Another tried to maintain composure, but his bloodshot eyes betrayed sheer panic. The shouting grew louder and more relentless, with the press capturing every moment, turning this disgrace into an indelible mark in the history of the police force. Those who once abused their power openly were now crushed by the weight of public outrage, with nowhere left to hide. The judge struck the gavel repeatedly, demanding order, but the courtroom remained inflamed. The crowd didn't just want an apology, they wanted justice to be carried through to the end. Charles's belated apology only deepened the contrast. A man who once stood at the peak of power, forced to admit his wrongs, while the officers, once seen as symbols of the law, now collapsed under scorn. The moment was broadcast live nationwide, watched by millions who felt the impact through their screens. For many, this was when justice was no longer just spoken, it was made visible in the image of a once proud man bowing his head, and of officers who had abused their authority, unable to withstand the public's roar. From that point forward, society knew a dark chapter had closed, opening the way for a new path where truth could speak, no matter how deeply others had tried to bury it. After the trial concluded, the entire nation turned its attention to Maya Green as a reflection of resilience and the power of knowledge. The press called her the beacon of justice, with editorials praising the courage of a woman who once stood at the bottom of society but shook an entire power structure. Many schools displayed her image in assembly halls, alongside the, quote, "You cannot kill the truth," as a reminder to younger generations about the value of honesty. Parents told Maya's story to their children as proof that background does not define dignity, and that only willpower and knowledge can take a person far. Admiration for her spread widely, from humble workers to intellectuals, all agreeing that Maya had done what few dared to do: stand up when crushed and hold on to dignity in the face of power. Despite the media spotlight, Maya chose a different path. She turned down offers for endorsements, television deals, and flashy appearances that could have turned her name into a brand. Maya understood she was not a celebrity, and the truth she defended should never be commercialized. Instead, she quietly returned to education, a field once lost in her youth that now held her full faith. Maya began teaching small classes in poor neighborhoods, where children could learn foreign languages and hold books they had only seen on TV. She encouraged them to study not to escape poverty, but to believe in themselves, to know that knowledge could become a powerful weapon against injustice. At first, the public was surprised by her choice, but soon came to understand. Images of Maya teaching in a modest room, with an old chalkboard and a passionate voice, spread quickly. People saw the difference between a true symbol and a flashy star. She did not chase fame, but patiently sowed seeds for the future. That only earned her greater respect, as she proved the greatest victory is not in defeating your enemy, but in keeping your soul intact after the storm has passed. Years later, when people recalled the scandal, they didn't only speak of the downfall of Charles Beckett or the corrupt police network. More importantly, they remembered Maya as a shining example of integrity and perseverance. The lesson remained clear: power can crumble, money can vanish, but knowledge and dignity, once protected, become guiding lights for an entire community. Maya chose the path of education over glamour, and that choice etched her name into collective memory, as proof that truth not only survives but blossoms into lasting seeds for generations to come. After all the turmoil, Charles Beckett was no longer the name that once made the financial world tremble. His assets were frozen, the company fell into the hands of the board of directors, and his political connections slowly dissolved. He quietly became an aging man walking alone through an empty park. But from within that loss, he learned a lesson that years of power had never taught him: humility. He began spending more time visiting his son Lucas, listening instead of commanding, teaching him that truth matters more than prestige. On Charles's gaunt face, arrogance was replaced by exhaustion and a trace of peace that comes from finally understanding what truly matters. He no longer thought of challenges or bold wagers, because with each passing day, he realized that his existence was now defined by how he treated others, not by the number in his bank account. Meanwhile, the police force had to face the heavy consequences of the scandal. A series of trials was held, and each officer who had abused their power was publicly named, their bowed heads in front of cameras, stirring both outrage and grim satisfaction. The verdicts didn't stop at individuals but opened the door to a wave of internal investigations. Many high-ranking leaders were replaced, a range of new oversight policies were implemented, and witness protection mechanisms were established to prevent further acts of violence in the shadows. The public no longer accepted empty promises. They took to the streets, demanding real reform and turning pressure into a force that compelled the system to change. In the media, the phrase "reform wave" appeared everywhere, reflecting an unprecedented shift within the institution. Public forums were organized at schools, churches, and community centers, where police officers were required to listen directly to citizens and respond to difficult questions about accountability and transparency. An entire generation of young officers, witnessing the downfall of their predecessors, began to realize that credibility didn't come from a gun or a badge, but from the trust they earned. In that picture, the image of Maya teaching children and the image of Charles quietly holding his son's hand became two contrasting yet complementary tones. One rose from the shadows to spread light, the other stepped down from the heights to rediscover humanity. The truth did more than expose wrongdoings. It sparked lasting change in society. Police officers were put on trial, public institutions came under pressure to reform, and those who once stood on opposite sides of the battlefield ended up sharing the same lesson. Power cannot endure without honesty and humility. And as the story gradually came to a close, the public realized that the greatest value did not lie in the fall of Beckett or the verdicts handed to abusive officers, but in the restoration of trust. People began to believe that the voice of one individual, if steadfast, could become a flame that lights up a whole community. Maya became a symbol of knowledge, Charles a sign of late awakening, and the police force a target compelled to reform to avoid repeating its mistakes. These were lasting impressions that proved justice, though often obstructed, still has a path to emerge into the light, and that lesson would be remembered for years to come. After all the events that once made Maya's name widely known, she chose not to rest in comfort or appear at glamorous events, but instead devoted all her energy to building a different path. In a poor neighborhood where children often dropped out of school early to help their families, Maya rented an old house that had been abandoned for years. She and a few neighbors cleaned it up, repainted the peeling walls, and lined up worn desks and chairs into neat rows. On opening day, a simple wooden sign hung on the door read, "Community Language Center." Any child could walk in without paying a single cent in tuition. Maya wanted this place to become a home for knowledge, where anyone could learn to use language to broaden their horizons, to gain the confidence to stand up just as she once did. The cheerful chatter of children echoed through the space, blending with the sound of basic lessons that Maya taught with patience. She began with the alphabet, with simple greetings in various languages, then gradually moved on to word formation and storytelling. Each child's eyes widened with amazement as they realized they could read and understand words that once seemed foreign. Maya was not only teaching language, she was teaching them to believe that knowledge has no boundaries, that poverty could not confine their dreams. The pure eyes, looking up at her with admiration, became her most precious reward, erasing all the scars Maya once carried. Adrian Cole, who once stood by her in a moment of peril, now remained at her side in this new journey. He not only offered legal support but also spent time helping her build the curriculum. Adrian reached out to nonprofit organizations, seeking donations of books and materials, while Maya focused on training young, passionate volunteers. Gradually, the center expanded beyond one small classroom to include activity rooms, even a small library filled with books. Residents in the neighborhood called Maya and Adrian the companions of knowledge, and the bond between them went far beyond colleagueship, becoming a deep connection they both cherished. Each evening, after the classes ended, Maya and Adrian would often sit together in the small room, sharing new plans. Sometimes they discussed launching online classes for children in remote areas. Other times they simply sat in silence, watching the kids leave with smiles on their faces. In the dim glow of a hanging ceiling lamp, Adrian looked at Maya with trust and admiration, while Maya felt a rare sense of peace in having a loyal companion by her side. Amid all the trials they had faced, they found comfort in each other and, from that, drew renewed strength to continue planting the seeds of knowledge. The presence of the Language Center quickly spread, drawing support from many charitable organizations, while public opinion saw it as proof that a person could transform pain into hope. Maya no longer needed praises. Every time Veri stepped into the classroom and saw small hands raised to answer in a newly learned language, she knew her journey truly mattered. And beside her, Adrian was always there, a quiet yet steadfast anchor, helping to continue their story not through outrage or struggle, but through the light of education and belief in the next generation. Since the Language Center began operating, Maya's voice has extended beyond the classroom and children's notebooks. She was frequently invited to conferences, community forums, and television programs about human rights. Wherever she went, Maya held firm to a clear stance, her voice resonating strongly as she openly criticized racial prejudice and class discrimination. She recounted her journey not to dramatize it, but to show how insults and violence rooted in bias do not just harm individuals, but corrode the very fabric of society. Each time she stood before the public, thousands listened in silence, because they knew this woman did not speak in slogans, but in truth proven through both blood and tears. International newspapers began calling Maya the voice of justice. She did not shy away from tough debates, even directly challenging politicians when they voiced conservative views. Many clips of her speeches went viral on social media, drawing millions of shares. In academic articles, professors cited Maya as a living example of how language can dismantle walls of prejudice. What made the public trust her even more was her humility. She never claimed to be a hero, always emphasizing that anyone, if given access to knowledge and the courage to speak up, could change society. The public came to see her as a new symbol, with Maya's image appearing on murals throughout the city, on magazine covers, and in youth education programs. Many began calling her the Teacher of Justice, a simple title that carried profound respect. Maya had once been a maid looked down on, mocked in a conference room, but from that very humble place, she rose to become a voice that even the powerful had to hear. That transformation was not about a change in status, but a process of turning humiliation into strength, turning silence into words of power. When Maya stepped into the grand halls, the light shining on her face illuminated not just an individual, but the journey of all those who had once been left behind. From a mocked maid, she became a social symbol, a symbol of the belief that justice can arise from the humblest places. And in every gaze that followed her, people saw that Maya's story did not end with a trial, but would live on through every generation, as a flame against discrimination and injustice. A year had passed since the trial ended. The once quiet, poor neighborhood now came alive every morning, as groups of children lined up outside the faded wooden door of the language center Maya had founded. From a small room with only a few dozen students, it had expanded into multiple classrooms, with donated desks, a library filled with books from universities, and even international volunteers arriving to help teach. The joyful chatter of students echoed through the narrow alleyways, greetings in English, French, and Japanese mixing with bright laughter, turning the center into an island of knowledge in a sea of hardship. Locals saw it as a source of pride, proof that change could begin with one person brave enough to stand for the truth. Maya walked through the classrooms, her gaze gentle but always bright with conviction. She listened to students read short sentences, corrected their small mistakes, and then encouraged them with a warm smile. Some children who once had to drop out due to poverty could now confidently stand before the class and translate simple passages, and each moment like that filled Maya's heart with joy. On the walls, handwritten posters displayed inspirational quotes from her, copied by students as daily reminders. The center had become more than a school, it was a shared home, a place where people found hope and opportunity. On the center's one-year anniversary, the small auditorium was packed to the last seat. Parents brought flowers, students carried clumsy but heartfelt cards. Reporters were there too, not to cover a scandal, but to document a journey of transformation. Maya stood in the center of the room, her face radiant, hands resting lightly on the wooden podium. She looked around and saw gratitude and hope in every pair of eyes, then smiled and spoke, her voice calm yet far-reaching. A person's worth isn't measured by a paycheck. It's found in conviction, in honesty, and in the knowledge we choose to share. That sentence sparked a wave of applause, and many were moved to tears, because they understood that what once began as a cruel challenge had been turned by Maya into a lesson for society. From a mocked maid, she had become a teacher, a symbol, yet remained grounded in humility. In the eyes of children and in the respect of the community, Maya Green had not only won a trial but triumphed over prejudice, proving that justice and knowledge could be reborn from even the humblest beginnings. As night fell, the laughter of students still echoed around the center, the warm yellow light spilling from the old window casting a glow over the corner of the street. Maya sat by the window, flipping through pages of her old journal, her eyes calm with peace. That journey had ended, but it opened a new path, one where every child stepping out of that room would carry the flame of knowledge, continuing to spread the message that human dignity can never be priced. And at the end of that road, Maya's smile was like a full stop, closing the story while leaving behind an echo of inspiration for generations to come. During the one-year anniversary celebration of the Language Center, with the hall filled with laughter and applause, a quiet figure sat motionless in the very back row. Charles Beckett, once a powerful, arrogant man who commanded the city's attention, now hid in the crowd, his aged face lined with regret, his eyes heavy with remorse. He sat unnoticed, no longer remarkable, yet the sounds from the stage echoed deeply in his mind, where Maya Green stood sharing her journey of turning pain into the light of knowledge. Every word felt like a blade cutting into his memory, bringing back the moment he once slammed a piece of paper onto the table and mocked a maid who dared cross the line. Now, in the cheers of the crowd, Charles felt small, like an outsider watching the life he had lost to his own mistakes. Charles's eyes followed Maya, no longer with contempt or resentment, but with a late admission. He regretted not only losing wealth and power, but also losing the chance to preserve his character from the beginning. When he saw the children confidently reciting greetings in different languages, he suddenly realized that what he once dismissed was exactly what the world needed most: knowledge and faith. That regret weighed on his shoulders, and for the first time in years, he bowed his head for a long while, a silent act of repentance before life itself. Maya didn't see Charles, or perhaps she knew he was there, but chose instead to focus on her students and those who believed in her. She smiled, her voice clear and steady. We may be born into different circumstances, but human worth is never found in status or the money in our pockets. Justice doesn't come from wealth, but from the courage to stand when truth is trampled. The words fell like stones, and the entire hall fell silent for a moment, then erupted into thunderous applause. Maya's final words became the closing message of the entire story, a reminder not only to those present, but to the entire society watching on television. People understood that true strength doesn't lie in wealth or power, but in the courage to speak up when it matters. From a mocked housemaid, Maya proved that the truth can overturn any balance, and justice will always find its path if someone dares to lead the way. In the crowd, Charles closed his eyes, letting the thunderous applause wash over him like a crashing wave. He felt the stark contrast between his arrogant past and the regret-filled present, but at least in that moment, he realized that justice wasn't some distant concept. It existed in every action taken to tell the truth and defend it. And when he opened his eyes, the sight of Maya on stage, glowing under the lights, became undeniable proof that justice could never be bought. only built from the courage of those who refuse to be silenced. The story closed on a sunlit afternoon, with the pure laughter of children echoing through the language center Maya Green had poured her heart into building. Her journey didn't start from a place of prestige, but from the depths of scorn, from the mocking words and disdainful looks of Charles Beckett and the officers who once treated her like a joke. But from that pit, Maya rose not through power or wealth, but through knowledge and resolve. Every translated page, every firm word in court, every tireless hour in her modest classroom had woven a path that made an entire society take notice. From a mocked maid, Maya became a voice for justice, a beacon of hope for generations to come. While Maya rose, Charles Beckett was left to confront the reality of his own downfall. He lost everything that once made him proud: wealth, power, status. From a commanding millionaire, he became a quiet man seated in the back row, watching Maya shine. But that loss planted in him a lesson about humility, about the true worth of conscience. The image of Lucas, his teenage son, became a mirror forcing Charles to see that money could never measure integrity, nor shield him from the judgment of society or the gaze of his own child. The police officers who once abused their power, thinking Beckett's protection would shield them, eventually fell before the force of justice. They were brought to trial amid public outrage, becoming symbols of corruption when power lacks responsibility. But their downfall wasn't in vain. It sparked a wave of reform, forcing the system to change, pushing law enforcement to reevaluate the core of their duty. And within that wave, Maya's name rose once more, as the flame that ignited transformation. Looking back on the entire journey, people realized that the greatest value Maya left behind was not her victory over Beckett, nor the fact that she was hailed as a symbol, but her choice afterward. Maya didn't step into the glamorous world, didn't turn herself into a media figure, but quietly returned to knowledge, opened a center for underprivileged children, and planted seeds for the future. In the bright eyes of her students, Maya found the most enduring victory because it was a victory of kindness and belief. The lesson from this story is profound and lasting. It shows that a person, no matter how belittled, can still rise if they believe in truth and knowledge. It affirms that justice is not built on power or wealth, but on the courage to speak when everyone else wants you silent. Maya Green proved that pain can become strength, mockery can become a stepping stone, and that intellect, when nurtured, becomes a weapon no one can take away. For Charles Beckett, his journey left a counterpoint. A reminder that arrogance and greed, no matter how shielded by wealth, must ultimately bow before the truth. And for society, this story was a wake-up call, showing that each individual has a responsibility to uphold justice, and when a community stands united, dark forces will be pushed back, step by step. In the end, Maya smiled in the embrace of her students, repeating the words she once said in court: "A person's worth is not measured by their monthly salary." That wasn't just a message for the children in her classroom, but for everyone seeking the meaning of justice and dignity. Maya's story will continue to be retold, not as a tragedy, but as an endless source of inspiration, affirming that truth, once defended, has the power to change the world.